At the dawn of the 20th century, Germany was a success story. Railways wove the country together like a steel web. Factories operated day and night without pause. As Berlin's streets were lit with electricity, the names Siemens and Bayer became symbols of a new era. Machinery, reason, and discipline were turning Germany into an industrial giant, a land of the future. Karl Benz's automobile was on the roads. Bayer's pills were healing the world. Krupp's steel cannons symbolized the power of an empire. From Berlin to Cologne, from Hamburg to Munich, everyone believed Germany had already claimed its place in the sun. But that place in the sun would come with a shadow. Germany emerged on the stage of history not only as a unified state with the proclamation of the empire at the Palace of Versailles on January 18, 1871. This unification, achieved through Prussia's military victories, brought with it serious internal and external political challenges that needed resolution. It possessed a complex political structure and a fragile balance. The empire included no fewer than 25 separate states. This fragmentation continued to be felt even after unification. Prussia was dominant, but regions like Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg maintained their distinct identities. The Catholic South kept its distance from the Protestant North. The urban bourgeoisie built cultural and class barriers against the rural peasantry. Minorities such as Jews and Poles, though officially citizens, were not regarded as truly German. This multi-layered structure fed not only sociological tensions, but also political ones. Port cities like Hamburg and Bremen had embraced capitalism, while in the south, agriculture still held sway. Germany was less a nation-state than a collection of different worlds united under a common authority. Industrialization deeply transformed the social structure. The urban bourgeoisie became the main actors shaping economic and cultural life in the major cities, while millions of workers from the countryside concentrated in industrial centers. Cities like Berlin, Essen, and Dortmund became home to large working-class populations. Workers labored long hours in harsh conditions, while middle-class families lived in modern apartments in city centers. Working-class families resided in small, airless, and unhealthy homes. This stark contrast in living conditions and provided fertile ground for socialist ideas. The first 20 years of the empire were dominated by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. His main domestic political goal was to consolidate the new unity established under Prussian hegemony. The reluctance of the Catholic states in the south led to fractures within the internal political fabric. Bismarck sought to strengthen central authority through the Kulturkampf policy, waged against the Catholic Church between 1871 and 1878. However, this effort ultimately backfired, resulting in the rise of the Catholic Centre Party. Bismarck also took harsh measures against the rapidly rising workers' movement. The Social Democratic Party, founded in 1875, quickly gained significant social support. Although parties like the SPD, the Catholic Centre Party, and the National Liberals held seats in the Reichstag, they had little influence over the executive branch. While parliamentary pluralism was developing, the structure of the constitutional monarchy did not permit a true democratic transformation. In Germany, although industry was the driving force of modernization, political control remained in the hands of one dominant class for a long time: the Junkers. Although the term originally meant young noble in medieval German, by the 19th century it referred to the conservative aristocratic class that owned vast estates, particularly in Eastern Prussia. Their estates were primarily located in the East Elbian region. Rye fields, large farms, and control over the peasantry formed the foundation of the Junkers' economic power. But their influence extended far beyond the land. The Junkers played a decisive role in the political and military structures of the German Empire. The upper echelons of the Kaiser's bureaucracy, the foreign ministry, and especially the military were largely filled with members of this class. The officer corps of the Prussian army was predominantly drawn from Junker families. Discipline, loyalty, and traditionalism shaped their outlook on both the army and the state. Bismarck himself was a Junker and one of the chief figures who brought the values of this class into the heart of state governance. While modern industrialists struggled to make their voices heard in Parliament, the Junkers retained political power independently of parliamentary arithmetic. Even as the rise of social democracy and the growing strength of the industrial bourgeoisie began to corner them over time, they would manage to retain their political influence until the very end of the empire. A new era for Germany and Europe would begin with the accession of Wilhelm II in 1888. The young Wilhelm became the German emperor, a figure full of contradictions. In what came to be known as the Year of the Three Emperors, he ascended the throne following the deaths of his grandfather, Wilhelm I, and shortly thereafter his father, Friedrich III. He was young, energetic, and ambitious. And perhaps most importantly, he was flawed. The congenital deformity in his left arm, shorter and underdeveloped, was more than just a physical limitation. Over the years, it would evolve into a deep-seated inferiority complex, a need to compensate, a constant desire to prove his strength to the outside world. Wilhelm was a monarch who felt like Napoleon one day and a Victorian gentleman the next, swinging between his emotions. His childhood was shaped by the influence of his English mother, Victoria, who had hoped to raise him as a liberal. However, in time, Wilhelm would come to resent both his mother and England itself. The young Kaiser had not taken part in the battles that had forged the German Empire. He failed to grasp that a state founded in blood and by the sword could only survive through diplomacy and restraint. He would reject Bismarck's authority and his cautious policy of realpolitik. To the young emperor, foreign policy was like a stage. Challenging Britain at sea, joining the colonial race in Africa, and engaging in diplomatic spats with Russia were not part of a coherent strategy. They were displays of power, mere showpieces. There was no trace of a planned, patient, or multilateral diplomacy. Almost allergic to the word strategy, the Kaiser would change his stance with every crisis, taking actions based on the suggestions of those around him. In 1890, he dismissed Bismarck, effectively altering Germany's course. Alongside Bernhard von Bülow, whom he called "my own Bismarck," he adopted a new foreign policy direction, Weltpolitik, or world policy. This policy aimed to transform Germany into a global empire, extending its influence far beyond Europe. In his famous speech to the Reichstag in 1897, Foreign Minister Bernhard von Bülow declared that Germany was seeking a place in the sun. However, this assertive stance would soon bring Germany into direct confrontation with Britain, France, and Russia. With the unification of the German state came the pathway to economic unification. The Zollverein German Customs Union, originally established in 1834, evolved after 1871 into a powerful economic framework encompassing nearly all German territories. The removal of customs barriers between the various states not only liberalized trade, but also laid the foundation for a common market. During this period, railways became the main arteries of industry. In the 1870s, the railway network stretched 20,000 kilometers. By the early 20th century, it had surpassed 60,000 kilometers. Ports were expanded, and transportation along rivers such as the Rhine and the Elbe was improved. The German domestic market came to resemble a nervous system tightly connected and highly responsive. From the 1880s onward, Germany emerged as a leading nation of the Second Industrial Revolution. The transformation in sectors such as chemicals, electricity, and heavy industry would soon propel Germany to technological supremacy. Major companies like Siemens, AEG, Krupp and Bayer stood out not only in Europe but also globally, thanks to their production and export capacities. Siemens and AEG became pioneers in electric appliances and urban electrification across Europe, with cities like Berlin becoming some of the first European metropolises to be illuminated by electricity. Germany's emphasis on technical education played a decisive role in this success. Polytechnic schools and institutes of applied science trained skilled engineers and technicians to serve industry directly. The collaboration between universities and industry would become a key driver in Germany's rise. Alongside traditional sectors like iron and coal, new industries such as chemicals, electricity, and mechanical engineering experienced significant breakthroughs. By the early 20th century, Germany's machinery exports had increased sixfold, and the label "Made in Germany" had become synonymous worldwide with quality, durability, and innovation. Another invention whose foundations were laid during those years would come to shape Germany's destiny. With the development of internal combustion engines, the foundations of the global automotive industry were being established, and its pioneers emerged in Germany. In 1885, Carl Benz designed the first gasoline-powered automobile in the city of Mannheim. This vehicle would go down in history as the Benz patent motor wagon. In 1886, his wife, Bertha Benz, famously drove it from Mannheim to Pforzheim, proving its reliability. Almost simultaneously, Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach began developing high-speed gasoline engines, working to make automobiles more efficient and widespread. Daimler Motorengesellschaft DMG introduced the brand Mercedes, naming their cars after the daughter of the company's Austrian distributor, Emil Jelinek. Germany's leadership in the chemical sector was even more pronounced. Companies like Bayer made groundbreaking advances not only in dyes and pharmaceuticals, but also in agricultural chemicals and synthetic products. Their research and development activities turned Germany into a global powerhouse that. Products like aspirin, developed by Bayer, gained worldwide recognition, not just for their medical value, but also for their economic impact. In the steel and heavy industry sectors, companies such as Krupp and Thyssen stood out. The Ruhr and Saar regions, rich in iron ore and coal, became the industrial heart of Germany. In steel production, Germany had become a major force, competing directly with the traditional industrial giants of Europe and beyond. Although Germany rose to prominence as an industrial nation, agriculture continued to hold significant importance. The vast estates owned by the Prussian aristocracy formed the core of rye and wheat production. In 1879, the Tariff Act introduced protective duties on imports. This led to the formation of the Coalition of Iron and Rye, an alliance between industrialists and large landowners that became the political foundation of the German economy. However, unlike Britain's free market model, Germany adopted a state-supported, bank-driven growth strategy. Institutions such as Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank provided substantial capital to newly founded companies. Germany also became a key player in foreign investments. Projects like the Baghdad Railway exemplified how Germany combined its economic strength with strategic diplomatic goals. The military played a crucial role in the construction of the new Germany. The German army was a foundational pillar of the state. The unification of Germany in 1871, led by Prussia, was achieved largely on the battlefield. As such, the newly established empire built its political legitimacy directly on the prestige of the military. This set the army-state relationship in Germany apart from that of other European countries. The German army became something of an ideological source for the new state. During Bismarck's era, respect for the military was institutionalized. Bismarck's foreign policy, based on diplomacy and balance, positioned the army as a limited but disciplined force. However, like many other aspects of the country, this understanding would change with the accession of Wilhelm II in 1888. Wilhelm's personal ambition transforming the empire into a global power turned the army into more than just a defensive institution. It became a tool for expansion and prestige. During this period, the German General Staff became one of the most professional and systematic planning institutions in all of Europe. The officers at its helm were responsible not only for operational planning, but also for shaping strategic vision and long-term political objectives. The military was not merely a war machine and ideology building. Helmuth von Moltke had modernized the Prussian army in the 1860s, developing a rapid movement strategy based on railway transportation. Another prominent figure in the German army before the war was Erich von Falkenhayn. Rising through the ranks of the War Ministry bureaucracy, Falkenhayn became known for his commitment to technological modernization. He led reforms in military education, enhanced the technical competence of officers, and integrated new battlefield technologies into the army. The Prussian War Academy became one of the most prestigious officer schools in Europe. It trained not only German officers, but also military personnel from neighboring countries, including the Ottoman Empire. The German army had also become one of the most technically advanced forces of its time. In areas such as artillery, machine guns, communication equipment, gas masks, and field telephones, Germany led Europe in military innovation. The heavy artillery produced by the Krupp Company, including mobile batteries that could be transported by rail, provided the army with a high degree of operational flexibility. The systematic construction of military railway lines ensured troop mobility. On the naval front, Germany experienced a systematic expansion beginning in 1898 with the passage of the naval laws. Under the leadership of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the Tirpitz Plan was developed, aiming to build a fleet capable of challenging Britain's naval supremacy. This plan triggered a full-scale battleship race, and the Imperial Navy soon became the second largest navy in Europe. But the consequences of this build-up extended far beyond technology. The naval race played a crucial role in the lead-up to the Great War. Aware that Germany's naval expansion was directed against them, the British responded by accelerating their own naval development, most notably with the launch of the HMS Dreadnought, a revolutionary warship that reset the balance of naval power. Diplomatic steps accompanied these military developments. The naval arms race was a major factor in the formation of the Triple Entente in 1907. As Germany expanded its sea power in pursuit of its Weltpolitik, also found itself facing a growing number of adversaries. In the eyes of the public, the military was not just a war-making force, it was a symbol of national pride. Through the system of compulsory military service, every male citizen assumed the identity of a defender of the nation. For German youth, the army was not only an institution of discipline, but also a path to social mobility and a source of belonging. As war approached, Germany possessed an army that was prepared both technologically and organizationally. Yet this very readiness also revealed a significant vulnerability: the military plans lacked flexibility. The central blueprint for Germany's wartime strategy was the Schlieffen Plan, named after former Chief of the General Staff Alfred von Schlieffen, who retired in 1906. The plan was designed for a scenario in which Germany would have to fight both France in the west and Russia in the east simultaneously. Bismarck's intricate system of diplomatic alliances had collapsed, and Germany increasingly saw itself as isolated and encircled. Schlieffen sought a solution based on swift, decisive action. His core assumption was that Russia, due to its vast geography and underdeveloped infrastructure, would require several weeks, possibly months, to fully mobilize. Therefore, Germany should focus all its strength on the Western Front in the opening days of the war, aiming for a rapid and crushing victory over France. The plan envisioned a sweeping flanking maneuver through Belgium, designed to encircle and quickly capture Paris. Once France was neutralized, German forces would then be shifted eastward to confront Russia. In essence, the plan was an asymmetric attack strategy. The Schlieffen Plan was not merely a military operation blueprint, it was a psychological belief system. Schlieffen emphasized the time-sensitive nature of the plan, writing, "Our right wing must sweep through France and crush the enemy. Everything depends on the speed of this operation." In his retirement, he continued to stress this point with prophetic urgency. Strengthen, strengthen, strengthen the right wing. When the time came to execute the plan, the younger Moltke would make a fatal error, the Schlieffen Plan. By 1914, Germany had become the second largest industrial power in the world, behind only the United States, and the leading economy in Europe, surpassing even Britain in industrial output. The country was producing enormous quantities of steel, coal, chemicals, and electricity. This economic growth also fueled Germany's political ambitions, now a power seeking its place in the sun. The German Empire sought to translate its industrial supremacy into political influence, challenging Britain's naval dominance, France's colonial empire, and Russia's massive population. This ambition became one of the key factors that would help ignite the war that would change history in 1914. At the dawn of the 20th century, Russia stood as an empire that, on one hand, appeared to command endless lands, and on the other, was decaying from within. On paper, it was one of the world's greatest powers. Yet beneath the surface, a barely suppressed rebellion simmered under the weight of superficial reforms, and chaos hid behind a facade of modernization. While liberal institutions and industrialization were gaining strength in Western Europe, Russia remained trapped in an absolute monarchy, a traditional agrarian economy, and a society suspended between tradition and change. The autocratic state represented by the Romanov dynasty appeared imposing from the outside, but carried within it fragility, contradictions, and mounting tension. This tension was not solely due to the regime's slow pace of reform. It stemmed equally from the social and political structures that struggled to adapt to the transformations of the modern age. Russia's most significant transformation in the 19th century was the abolition of serfdom in 1861. Though this reform appeared to free the peasants, in practice, most were left without access to land and remained under control through the communal land system known as mir. Russian peasant was shaped by these traditional village communities. The mir system, institutionalized after the emancipation of the serfs, referred to a communal administrative and economic structure in which agricultural land was managed collectively. Land was distributed according to family size, but ownership was communal rather than individual. Each mir was led by a starosta elder elected by its members, and land redistribution was carried out every few years to maintain balance. While intended to ensure fair allocation of scarce resources, the mir system discouraged individual agricultural initiative and efficiency. Peasants could only use the land while cultivating it. They could not sell or mortgage it. This limited the modernization of Russian agriculture and its capitalist development. Mir served as a practical tool for tax collection and organizing military obligations. It also tied the rural population to the central authority and restricted social mobility. By the early 20th century, the Stolypin reforms began to dismantle this system, but mir continued to influence the social fabric of rural Russia, both as a tool of solidarity and as an obstacle to development. The old chains had been removed, only to be replaced by invisible ones. A free labor market had not developed, nor had there been a significant leap in agricultural productivity. Nevertheless, beginning in the 1890s, a new economic era began in Russia under the leadership of Finance Minister Sergei Wheat. With state-supported industrialization efforts, Wheat aimed to connect the country's east and west through massive projects such as the Trans-Siberian Railway. These initiatives opened Russia further to foreign capital. In between 1893 and 1899, more than half of all industrial investments in Russia were financed by French and Belgian investors. Yet this development was unevenly distributed across the country. While industrial sectors flourished in rising centers such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Łódź, rural areas remained mired in poverty, low productivity, and heavy tax burdens. One of the main sources of revenue for the imperial treasury came from indirect taxes on vodka. This created a system in which the poorest segments of society bore the greatest share of public finance. Though Witty's policies laid the groundwork for a modern economic infrastructure, they also gave rise to waves of social unrest. Industrialization brought about the emergence of a working class that increasingly voiced demands for political representation and social security. These tensions were further inflamed by the authoritarian nature of the political system. Tsar Nicholas was an absolute monarch who believed himself to be God's representative on earth. He entered the stage of history slowly and hesitantly. He was Russia's last Tsar, perhaps its most reluctant one. Ascending to the throne in 1894 after the death of his father, Alexander, he was only 26 years old. Deeply educated and fluent in several languages, Nicholas lived more like a withdrawn aristocrat devoted to his family than a head of state. Those close to him described him as kind, emotional, and extremely shy. But this humility lacked the decisiveness and foresight required of a ruler. His personality clashed with the power his position demanded. He remained blindly loyal to a narrow circle of advisors, especially his wife Alexandra Fyodorovna and the mystic monk Rasputin, whose influence would grow strong enough to shape imperial decisions in the lead up to war. There was always a gap between the Tsar and his people. He could not truly grasp the poverty in industrial cities, the plight of peasant farmers, or the growing conflicts within the Duma. His world was confined to the elegant palace gardens of Tsarskoye Selo. As a father, he was affectionate, as a husband loyal, but as a Tsar, he was a figure unable to sense the spirit of his times. His romantic belief in sacred autocracy kept him distant from constitutional reforms. He was a monarch weighed down by the legacy of the past, entirely opposed to parliamentary representation, constitutional balance, or political pluralism. By the late 19th century, constitutional reform movements had gained traction among Russia's intellectual circles, but the state apparatus chose suppression over change. On top of all this, in 1904, Russia entered a new war in the Far East. At the start of the 20th century, two major powers clashed in Asia: Tsarist Russia and rapidly modernizing Japan. The region in question was Manchuria and Korea territories that Russia aimed to dominate. After defeating China in the War of 1894 to 1895, Japan had begun establishing its sphere of influence there. However, following the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, an intervention by Germany, France, and Russia forced Japan to withdraw from Port Arthur. In response, Russia signed a secret treaty with China in 1896, gaining railway privileges in Manchuria. After the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, it increased its military presence in the region. When Russia leased Port Arthur in 1898, it crossed what Japan considered a red line. This port was vital to Japan's security. Diplomatic negotiations continued through 1903. Japan offered to recognize Russia's influence in Manchuria in exchange for a free hand in Korea. But Russia wanted to expand its influence in both regions. This deadlock led to a surprise attack by Japan on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before a formal declaration of war. Japan was applying its first-day victory strategy. Though the attack did not destroy the entire Russian Pacific Fleet, it inflicted serious damage. Japan's preemptive strike outraged Russian public opinion. The initial response was one of patriotic fervor. Students filled the streets, prayers were offered, and declarations of loyalty were sent to the Tsar. The Japanese War was perhaps Nicholas's last opportunity to regain the people's trust. But from the summer, as military failures mounted, enthusiasm turned into disappointment. Even the conservative press began to express admiration for Japanese discipline and bravery. Capital newspapers wrote that propaganda promising a short and victorious war had lost all credibility. The conflict began to severely damage the morale of an already burdened society. Mobilization triggered widespread unrest. In Western Russia and Poland, draft orders were met with protests and, at times, outright revolts. Pogroms against Jews erupted in cities like Odessa, Warsaw, and Gomel, often fueled by the anger of soldiers who did not want to go to the front. In some places, workers went on strike, interpreting mobilization as a death sentence for the Tsar's sake. While society in Russia began to boil over, Japanese forces advanced on land as well. One of the war's turning points came at the Battle of Mukden in Manchuria, where Japan scored a major victory over Russian forces. The defeat shattered the morale of the Imperial Army and pushed the political elite in St. Petersburg to consider peace. In this situation, Tsar Nicholas II played his final card. The Russian Baltic Fleet made a grueling journey of thousands of miles to the region, aiming to break Japan's naval superiority and shift the tide of the war. But Japan was prepared. Admiral Togo Heihachiro's fleet lay in wait at the Tsushima Strait. The Battle of Tsushima, which began on the morning of May 27th, would become one of the most devastating naval battles in modern history. Togo's ships, with flawless maneuvers, secured total dominance over the Russian battleships. Using the now famous T-cross maneuver, the Japanese cut off the Russian fleet and kept it under constant fire. The tactic quickly turned the battle in Japan's favor. By the end, only a handful of Russia's 38 warships survived. The rest were either sunk or surrendered. Most of the Baltic fleet was destroyed before it had even fully entered Japanese waters. With this victory, Japan gained immense prestige and took a decisive step toward becoming a global power. The events at Tsushima marked a rupture in the global balance of power. The defeat not only ended Russia's naval presence in the Pacific, but also shattered the Tsarist regime's public legitimacy. The fury that had begun to seep through the palace walls in St. Petersburg was now unstoppable. What had begun as a war pursued with dreams of an easy victory turned into a national disaster. Japan's modern weaponry and well-trained troops had defeated Russia in every battle. The Tsar's prestige was in ruins. And the seeds of the Great Revolt had already been planted, even before the war had ended. Massive strikes, marches, and peasant uprisings had begun to erupt across Russia. By mid-1905, both sides of the conflict, Russia and Japan, were growing more inclined toward peace due to mounting economic and social pressures. Japan, in particular, was running out of financial resources and could no longer sustain the cost of war. Through the mediation of US President Theodore Roosevelt, both parties agreed to peace talks held in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in August 1905. As a result of these negotiations, Russia renounced its rights in southern Manchuria and recognized Japan's dominance over Korea. Following the war, Russia was left in a highly volatile state. Under mounting pressure, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to issue the October Manifesto, which led to the establishment of the Duma. For the first time, the people would gain some form of political representation. However, this development was quickly placed within boundaries drawn by the regime. The fundamental laws adopted in 1906 severely curtailed the powers of the Duma and reaffirmed the Tsar's absolute authority in the legislative process. In short order, the Duma became a symbolic institution, stripped of real influence and incapable of exerting authority over the military or imperial bureaucracy. Still, this period saw opposition movements become more institutionalized and widespread. The socialist revolutionaries gained traction among the peasantry, while the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks grew stronger in large industrial cities. Underground pamphlets and union organizing became increasingly common. The workers' movements began to stage actions explicitly aimed at political representation and regime change. The political environment had opened up in form, but remained repressive in substance. And this suppressed arena would, in time, lay the groundwork for an even more explosive uprising. The Tsarist regime relied heavily on its army to maintain internal control. Since the second half of the 19th century, military academies had been expanded, officer training had been modernized. But these modernization efforts were far from complete when the catastrophic defeat against Japan deeply damaged the reputation of both the Russian military and the monarchy. Worse days were not far off for the Tsar. The closed nature of the political system began to create space for radical movements to flourish. The socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and especially the Bolsheviks were becoming increasingly powerful. The working class was no longer just dissatisfied with factory conditions, it had grown disillusioned with the system itself. In cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, strikes became part of daily life. As these labor strikes combined with the growing organization of Bolshevik and Menshevik factions, a wave of social radicalization began to erode the foundations of the regime. The industrial proletariat was developing political consciousness, while the rural masses began demanding land reform. According to the 1897 census, only 13% of Russia's population lived in urban areas, an indication of how limited the base of modernization truly was. As if all this were not enough, alarm bells were also ringing in Russia's foreign policy. The Russo-German rapprochement that had begun under Bismarck's alliance system collapsed with Kaiser Wilhelm's Weltpolitik. The Three Emperors League, orchestrated by Bismarck, had sought to balance Austria against Russia while keeping France diplomatically isolated. But Germany's new leadership abandoned this approach. In 1890, Germany chose not to renew the Reinsurance Treaty with Russia. German officials viewed Russia as a dangerous but manageable neighbor. But Russia was in no mood to accept such treatment. Germany's decision marked a clear shift in its eastern policy. In response, Russia turned immediately toward France, which had long sought an alliance with the Russian Empire. This diplomatic courtship culminated in the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894, a development that would dramatically shift Europe's balance of power. Germany now faced the looming possibility of a two-front war. From the Russian perspective, German activities in the Balkans conducted through Austria-Hungary were increasingly seen as expansionist and threatening. Especially after its defeat in the Far East, Russia began refocusing its attention on nearby regions, particularly the Balkans. Citing historical, cultural, and religious ties with the Orthodox Slavic peoples of the Balkans, Russia positioned itself as their natural protector. Serbs, Bulgarians, and other Slavic communities were. In contrast, Austria-Hungary, an empire that ruled over large Slavic populations in territories like Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia, viewed Russian support for Slavic nationalism as an internal threat. Despite these rising tensions, Russia and Austria reached a secret agreement in 1897 to preserve the status quo in the Balkans. Russia faced another persistent issue: the Ottoman Empire. The long-standing conflict with the Ottomans concealed major crises, one of the most important being the question of the Straits. For Russia, the issue was both military and economic. Grain and industrial goods exported from Black Sea ports reached European markets via the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. As such, any closure or foreign control of the Straits posed a grave threat to Russian interests. Even the brief closure of the Straits by the Ottoman Empire during the Balkan Wars of 1912 severely disrupted the Russian economy. The Black Sea coast is the lung of Russian trade, and the Straits are its only airway. For Russia, gaining control over this region had become a necessity. Yet despite these ambitions, Russia took care not to enter direct conflict with the Ottoman Empire. The Anglo-Russian Convention acted as a restraining force on the Tsar. Keen to preserve the newly forged balance with its British ally, Russia opted to wait for the right moment. Maintaining the status quo in relations with the Ottoman Empire, and even allowing it to remain weak, was seen as more advantageous to Russian interests. In other words, Russia did not want the Ottomans to collapse completely, but preferred them to survive in a weakened, manageable state. But as the Ottoman Empire began drawing closer to Germany, the equilibrium started to unravel. German influence in Istanbul grew particularly through projects like the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, which deeply alarmed Russia. Germany's prominent role in reorganizing the Ottoman military and the increasing involvement of German officers fueled growing Russian anxieties about the future of the Straits. This entire structure was a harbinger of collapse. A vast empire was trying to maintain traditional despotism alongside the institutions of a modern state-controlling society from the top down. Yet neither the economy, nor the political system, nor the military, nor the society itself had the resilience to sustain such pressure. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was still a great power on paper, but inside, it harbored a fragile, fragmented, and explosive reality. Beneath its surface grandeur lay deep cracks, and over time, the empire would become unable to bear the weight of its own contradictions. The empire, grown under the shadow of the Tsars, no longer possessed the flexibility to simultaneously respond to the demands of the people and its own internal tensions. Slow-moving reforms, suppressed opposition, and widening inequality had turned Russia into a simmering cauldron. And it would not be long before the lid blew off. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire was still the largest territorial power in the world. With colonies spread across 3 continents and dominance over global trade routes, it was a superpower both economically and militarily. However, its global supremacy was not based solely on its vast territories or trade networks. The real foundation of this dominance was the Royal Navy, the undisputed master of the seas. The Navy was not only a military force, but also a symbol of national pride. Britain's sense of security as an island nation was made possible by its control of the oceans. Therefore, naval superiority was seen by the British public as a guarantee of both prosperity and freedom. 58 out of every 100 calories consumed by the British came from overseas. For centuries, Britain had maintained absolute supremacy at sea, shielding itself from the destructive effects of continental wars. Since Trafalgar, the belief that he who rules the waves rules the world had become a national conviction. Thus, for the British, the Navy was a guarantee of security, the island's primary line of defence. Yet this sense of security and maritime dominance would not be enough to guarantee peace. Throughout the 19th century, Britain had pursued a strategy known as splendid isolation. Based on the natural geographical advantages of being an island and its maritime power, this policy allowed London to avoid entanglement in European alliance systems during times of crisis and war. Instead, it maintained flexible positions according to its own interests and intervened militarily or diplomatically when necessary. However, at the dawn of the 20th century, this strategy began to falter seriously. The global economic balance was shifting. Germany had made tremendous industrial advances over the last quarter century, and with its growing production capacity and trade power, it had become a direct rival to Britain. The United States was also expanding rapidly and beginning to play a significant role in global commerce. Britain was no longer the uncontested ruler of world trade. This growing competition was making Britain economically more vulnerable. The intensifying rivalry with Russia in Central Asia and the Far East, along with France's desire to expand in Africa, would push Britain away from its role as a detached balancer and towards seeking alliances. A turning point in Anglo-German relations was about to unfold. Germany's young ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm, was deeply fascinated by all things military and had a particular passion for naval power. As part of his Weltpolitik world policy, which aimed for Germany to reach the top in every domain, the Kaiser read The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a book written in 1894 by Alfred Mahan. Greatly influenced by the work, Wilhelm immediately began devising plans to expand Germany's naval strength. He requested funding from the Reichstag for 36 cruisers, but was only granted approval for 4. The German parliament did not share the Kaiser's vision. In response, Wilhelm recalled Alfred von Tirpitz from his post in the Far East in 1897. Like the Kaiser, Tirpitz believed the Navy had to be developed to a point where it could at least rival Britain's Royal Navy. After discussions between the two, Germany decided to implement a series of fleet acts. From 1898 to 1912, these laws would systematically strengthen the German Navy, allowing it to assert itself both in European waters and on the high seas. Germany's aggressive naval expansion sparked an uneasy rivalry between the two nations. The peak of this naval race was marked by the launch of HMS Dreadnought, a vessel that symbolized not just a warship, but the end of one era and the dawn of another. This massive battleship was a revolution in naval warfare. It was named after an English warship from the 16th century that had helped defeat the Spanish Armada. The name Dreadnought, meaning fearless, reflected the spirit of the new vessel. This Leviathan of the Royal Navy rendered all existing battleships obsolete at once. Armed entirely with large caliber guns, it featured a main battery of 10 12-inch 305 mm guns, far surpassing the firepower of contemporary warships. Instead of traditional coal-fired engines, it was powered by turbine engines, which were lighter and more efficient. These engines allowed the ship to reach a then stunning speed of 21 knots. In speed, range, and firepower, the Dreadnought achieved overwhelming superiority. Newspapers of the time rightly called it a revolution. Yet this technological triumph also marked the beginning of a nightmare. For the Germans, this development was a major challenge. To respond to Britain's great leap forward, the German Navy would push its production capacity to the limit, working tirelessly to build its own dreadnoughts. Tirpitz's formula was simple. In his eyes, a powerful navy represented far more than the barrels of battleships. It was a weight at the diplomatic table, a tool of international pressure and, if necessary, blackmail. Tirpitz had no intention of engaging the British fleet in a direct naval confrontation. His plan was to build a force that, even if not equal to the British fleet, could still inflict severe damage. That way, London would think twice before declaring war on Germany, knowing it would pay a heavy price. This theory would later be known as the risk theory. The naval laws of 1898 and 1900 were passed through the German parliament based on this strategic calculation. Officially, the new fleet was framed as a means to protect German interests. But the reality was different. Germany wanted to strike at the nerves of the British Empire. While planning the fleet's size and its new warships, Tirpitz deliberately targeted Britain's emotional weakness, its national pride in naval supremacy. If Germany could reach 60% of the strength of the British Navy, war would be too risky for London, thus giving Germany diplomatic leverage. But this plan provoked an unexpected reaction in Britain. Public pressure on the government reached its peak. The people demanded a response to Germany. In 1909, a massive naval campaign was launched under public pressure. Its most famous slogan became, "We want 8 and we won't wait." The public was shouting, "We want 8 battleships and we won't wait." At the time, Winston Churchill was serving as Home Secretary. After negotiations on the naval program, he summarized the outcome with characteristic wit. The Admiralty wanted 6, the economists recommended 4, and we finally settled on 8. But the arms race was no longer limited to naval competition. Crises, such as the Moroccan episodes at the beginning of the 20th century, brought Britain and Germany face to face and revealed a deepening sense of mistrust. These crises would ultimately lead Britain to abandon its policy of splendid isolation entirely. Facing the rising threat of Germany, Britain signed the Entente Cordiale with France. Initially, This agreement was not a military alliance but a mutual understanding concerning conflicting colonial interests. In the final quarter of the 19th century, Britain and France had experienced numerous tensions. Crises like the Fashoda incident in Sudan had brought the two empires to the brink of war. Africa had become the focal point of both Britain's and France's imperial ambitions. Control over the Nile and clashes over interests in West Africa created chronic friction between the two. However, the rise of Germany helped to push this old rivalry into the background. For both London and Paris, standing united against a common threat became a more rational choice than competing with each other. The Entente Cordiale was born under these circumstances. Britain secured France's recognition of its control over Egypt, while in return, it pledged not to interfere with French interests in Morocco. Other smaller colonial disputes were also settled under the agreement. Yet over time, the influence of the Entente Cordiale extended far beyond colonial matters. The climate of trust it created laid the groundwork for both countries to draw even closer as the German threat intensified. The First Moroccan Crisis, triggered by Germany's intervention in Morocco in 1905, accelerated this process. Germany's challenge to French influence in Morocco sent shockwaves through Paris. When the French realized they could not stand alone against such pressure, they turned to London for support. For the British, too, Germany's aggressive diplomacy was cause for concern. Britain had long sought to prevent any single power from establishing hegemony over the European continent. Germany's increasing boldness showed that Britain's old balance of power policies had once again become vital. In this context, secret military preparations began to take shape. Confidential military talks were held between the French and British general staffs. These meetings discussed how the British Army would assist and where it would be deployed in the event of a European war. However, the British government, wary of the anti-war sentiments within the Liberal Party, wanted to keep this military alignment out of public view. Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey maintained the policy of official neutrality by ensuring even Parliament was not informed of these talks. The British public had no idea which side their government might choose in a future European war. Germany would shake the status quo so profoundly that Britain and France, longtime enemies for nearly 1,000 years, would find themselves bound by a shared fate. And Germany wasn't just unsettling these two great powers. Russia, too, was increasingly anxious about its rising and growing neighbor. While negotiating with the French, the British also began courting the Russians. In 1907, the signing of the Anglo-Russian Entente would pave the way for what history would come to know as the Triple Entente. While Britain was forging new alliances abroad, its internal structure was far more fractured. The empire was not as solid as it appeared from the outside. Political and social balances within the island were hanging by a thread. Internally, the radical wing of the Liberal Party opposed military preparations, while Conservatives demanded a tougher stance against Germany. Even within cabinet meetings, deep divisions emerged, and there was no consensus on national defence policy. These disagreements were not limited to Parliament. Major cities across the island were shaken by social unrest. The Liberal Party, which came to power in 1906, embarked on a wave of welfare reforms. Under the leadership of Lloyd George, laws concerning pensions, unemployment insurance, and the protection of workers' rights were introduced. However, these reforms met fierce resistance from the upper class and the House of Lords. The uneven distribution of growing prosperity within the country stirred the masses into action. As war loomed, the British working class launched a wave of strikes that would go down in history as the Great Unrest, From coal mines to ports, railways to textile mills, hundreds of thousands of workers across the country went on strike due to poor working conditions. These strikes not only demanded better wages, but also called for job security, union rights, and humane working conditions. The deployment of the army by employers and the government in response was a clear sign of rising tensions and internal division. The unrest wasn't purely economic. The struggle of women for political rights opened another front of conflict across the nation. Suffragettes, frustrated by years of peaceful campaigning with no results, began turning to more militant tactics. From 1912 onward, acts of arson, window smashing, and hunger strikes became a part of daily life. The government's harsh responses, especially the forced feeding of hunger-striking prisoners, inflicted serious wounds on the public conscience. As if these upheavals weren't enough, the most fragile issue facing the United Kingdom, the Irish question was entering a new and dangerous phase. In 1912, Prime Minister Asquith's Liberal government reintroduced the long-debated Home Rule Bill to Parliament. This bill aimed to grant limited autonomy to Ireland, including the establishment of a parliament in Dublin and the devolution of certain local powers to the Irish. However, this move was seen as an act of betrayal by the Ulster movement. In Ulster, especially among Protestant workers and the bourgeoisie, there was deep fear that being governed by a Catholic majority would reduce them to minority status and jeopardize their religious rights. Under the leadership of Edward Carson, the Unionist movement openly resisted the law by proclaiming the Ulster Covenant, which was signed by over 500,000 people in 1912. The Protestants feared that if Ireland were ruled by the Catholic majority, their religious freedoms and social standing would be in danger. This fear wasn't confined to rhetoric. In 1913, the Ulster Volunteer Force was formed a paramilitary militia of 100,000 men, created to resist Home Rule. The Ulster Volunteers would soon begin secretly importing weapons from Germany. As the world hurtled toward war, the United Kingdom was on the brink of fighting one within its own borders. In response, Irish Catholic nationalists also established their own paramilitary group, the Irish Volunteers. Now, Ireland had two separate armies, each seemingly preparing for a civil war. As the clouds of war gathered over Europe, the island was already caught in a storm. The Irish issue, which would be postponed by the outbreak of World War I, remained a ticking time bomb for the United Kingdom. In the late 18th century, Sultan Mustafa III, who held the throne at the time, criticized his Grand Vizier Ragip Pasha for allegedly avoiding war with Russia. In response to the Sultan, the Pasha said, "My Sultan, I am not avoiding war. The Ottoman Empire resembles a roaring lion from afar. Its majesty alone frightens many European states. But if we go to war, our enemies will see that the roaring lion has no teeth in its mouth and no claws on its paws. Can a lion without teeth or claws have the power to tear anything apart?" 150 years had passed since the words of Ragip Pasha. Though belated, the statesman had begun to realize the state of affairs, and efforts for recovery had started. Almost no concrete results would be achieved. As the 20th century began, the Ottoman Empire was exhausted in every aspect. Many provinces had been lost. The only remaining lands were the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Arabian Peninsula. But especially the Balkans had always been, as throughout history, a boiling cauldron. In the 1880s, Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck had remarked, "One day, a great European war will break out over some damned foolish thing in the Balkans." He was not exaggerating. The Greeks, who had managed to separate early, the newly independent Serbs, and the Bulgarians, who had yet to break away, were all working with full force to stir the Balkan cauldron once again. After the Russo-Turkish War of 1877–78, the state declared financial bankruptcy, and its condition was pitiful. When Sultan Abdulhamid II ascended the throne in 1876, he faced immense difficulties. For decades, the British had been seen as the guarantors of the territorial integrity of the Ottoman state, but in the Russo-Turkish War, they had abandoned the Ottomans to face Russia alone. With the war came the unraveling of the Balkans, threatening the Ottoman presence in the region. The Treaty of Berlin had redrawn the borders of Ottoman Europe into a narrow corridor stretching from the Adriatic to the Aegean. They were extremely difficult to defend militarily against both external and internal enemies. The Balkan states surrounding the Ottoman territories harbored irredentist ambitions, seeking to claim either all or part of the lands left to the Ottomans by invoking the rights of minorities from their own ethnic or religious groups. After the war, the Sultan would begin restructuring the Ottoman army according to his own vision and ideas. Yet during the reign of Sultan Abdulaziz, expensive and fiscally irresponsible armament projects and wartime spending had led to extraordinary levels of both domestic and foreign debt. The Ottoman economy was in dire condition. Due to the mounting debt, even the salaries of civil servants and soldiers could no longer be paid. As a result of the pressure and threats exerted by creditor countries, chiefly France, to recover their loans and accumulated interest, it was decided on December 20th, 1881, to establish the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This administration, operating independently of the Ottoman treasury, would collect taxes from designated revenue sources and make principal and interest payments to creditors. Critical and highly profitable sources such as tobacco, alcohol, and salt were handed over to this administration. Under these conditions, implementing any meaningful army reform had become extremely difficult. Faced with these constraints, Abdulhamid prioritized creating a loyal, apolitical army that would be completely obedient to his reign and focused on dealing with internal enemies. The army's theoretical primary duty defending the country from external threats thus became secondary in the order of priorities. Abdulhamid planned to rely on the European balance of power and limited concessions to avoid potential wars. What mattered most to him was the army's loyalty and its ability to deal with domestic dissent. Like his uncle Abdulaziz, Sultan Abdulhamid was deeply interested in technical military innovations and educational institutions. However, the massive burden of debt and the loss of control over many revenue sources pushed the Sultan to make difficult choices about priorities. The navy built under Abdulaziz would be sacrificed. All available resources were allocated to the army, which had been tasked with the daunting challenge of defending the Balkans. Over time, some naval vessels would even be sold as scrap just to pay the salaries of civil servants. Abdulhamid's keen interest in military education reforms was, in large part, due to financial constraints. Military education was less expensive than importing foreign weaponry and promised greater returns. Seeking to increase his legitimacy in the eyes of the public, the Sultan launched a significant wave of reform focused on military schooling. The number of military schools established under Abdulaziz was to be increased. Cities like Baghdad, Beirut, Damascus, Edirne, Bursa, Manastir, Erzurum, Trabzon, Aleppo, Mosul, Thessaloniki, and Skopje were among the places where schools were opened. The fact that these schools were established primarily in areas with large Muslim and Turkish populations was no coincidence. The crushing defeat by the Russians, coupled with increasing political opposition, particularly from Christian groups, was beginning to reshape the character of the state. Around the cult of the Sultan, a new concept of patriotism was being constructed, one rooted in loyalty to the ruler and identification with the dynasty. The Ottomans took inspiration from the Austro-Hungarian Empire's approach to patriotism, which had been built around loyalty to the Habsburg dynasty within a multi-ethnic, multi-Welnages. Abdul Hamid's interest in the technological and educational dimensions of military reform, combined with his autocratic style of rule, his distrust towards senior military officials, led him to choose Germany as a military model and to request assistance from Germany in carrying out reforms. The German military mission that arrived in the capital in April 1882 would open the door to a new era for the Ottoman Empire. In earlier years, the army had been modelled after France. However, France's attempts to use its influence in the Ottoman Empire for political purposes gradually weakened ties between the two states. In particular, the French occupation of Tunisia in 1881 revealed that French influence posed a serious threat and that France had no intention of respecting the territorial integrity of the empire. From that point on, German influence within the Ottoman Empire would grow steadily. To improve military education, a German officer, Colmar von der Goltz, arrived in 1883 and would become the symbolic figure of Germany's growing influence in the Ottoman military. The military reform that had begun would bear its first fruits in the 1897 Greco-Turkish War. For the first time in its history, the Ottoman High Command was able to prepare for war with previously drawn-up deployment and mobilization plans. As early as 1886, von der Goltz had drafted plans targeting Greece. The Ottoman army succeeded in defeating the Greek forces. Above all, the Ottoman General Staff was able, for the first time, to function not merely as a bureaucratic office, but as an actual upper military headquarters. The management of the war was facilitated by the newly constructed railway and telegraph lines, and logistical operations were largely successful. This relatively easy victory and the seemingly effective reform efforts within the army prevented deeper structural problems from being recognized. Sultan Abdul Hamid, gripped by a paranoia over a potential military coup, viewed the assembly of large army units, even for maneuvers, as a threat to himself and his rule. As a result of this restriction, Ottoman pashas were never able to gain the experience of commanding their troops under real combat conditions. Likewise, due to their unfamiliarity with the speed and complexity of modern warfare, most pashas had little practical value in battle and often became more of a burden than an asset to their troops. Ottoman units lacked the capacity to operate above the battalion level or to carry out complex maneuvers. In order to preserve the stability of his reign and of the army, the Sultan kept senior commanders in their posts for excessively long periods, which blocked promotions and created a bottleneck, effectively eliminating advancement opportunities for the younger generation. This growing frustration within the upper echelons of the army became particularly widespread among young staff officers trained in the German style. Disillusioned by the internal security crises and the experience of irregular warfare against Balkan insurgents, these young officers lost faith in both the army and the political system. The war only deepened their exhaustion and hopelessness, pushing them toward political alternatives. Through connections with their classmates and comrades in arms, they began to form clandestine organizations in opposition to the autocratic regime. The disadvantaged Balkan territories, shaped by the Treaty of Berlin, were under threat from the Balkan nations, while the eastern provinces faced new challenges from the Armenians, who had for the first time gained special privileges. In the face of these threats, neither the Sultan nor the statesmen were able to devise an effective plan. The Sublime Porte prioritized diplomacy in hopes of preventing intervention by the great powers, rather than directly confronting the nationalist movements that were tearing the empire apart. As a result, the task of suppressing separatist uprisings was left entirely to provincial army units. Yet the commanders of these units, who had often obtained their posts through loyalty to the Sultan rather than merit, generally showed no interest in the responsibilities assigned to them, leaving the actual fighting to units already engaged with the separatists. The responsibility for defining, leading, and managing the strategy to combat separatist threats that jeopardized the unity and survival of the empire, was placed entirely in the hands of young officers at the regimental and battalion levels. The main subject of conflict in the Balkans, referred to in Ottoman sources as Rumelia, and by Europeans as Macedonia, was the region's complex ethnic composition. Due to its diverse population, Macedonia resembled an ethnographic museum. Turks, Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbs, Vlachs, Albanians, and Jews all lived together in the region. Despite this diversity, Turks had for centuries been the largest population group. For the Turks, Macedonia was a second homeland. The Ottoman Empire administered it as if it were a province of Anatolia. According to a census ordered by Hüseyin Hilmi Pasha in 1904, the region was home to 1.5 million Muslims, mostly Turks, 896,000 Bulgarians, 307,000 Greeks, 100,000 Serbs, and 99,000 Vlachs. This demographic structure encouraged the three states to which these populations were ethnically tied, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece, to lay claim to the territory of Macedonia. These insurgent activities were first initiated by Bulgarians and later expanded with the involvement of Greeks and Serbs. As terrorism and uprisings increased, Sultan Abdulhamid II issued an imperial decree in November 1902 regarding the Rumelian provinces. Under this decree, governors would be granted expanded powers, the judiciary would be made more independent, every village with at least 50 households would receive a school, and a general inspectorate would be established to oversee these efforts. Hüseyin Hilmi Pasha was appointed as the general inspector. It ultimately failed to dissuade the insurgent committees from continuing their acts of terror and aggression. At the center of the search for solutions to this crisis were young officers and intellectuals. The opposition, though composed of many different factions, was united around one idea: that the autocratic and arbitrary regime built by Sultan Abdulhamid was harming the nation's interests. By the last quarter of the 19th century, a question rising among Ottoman intellectuals abroad, what is to be done, began to take organizational form through political societies at the dawn of the new century. A common goal of these groups was the restoration of the constitutional monarchy that the Sultan had reluctantly declared in 1876. Some, such as the Ottoman Revolutionary Party, pushed for even more radical change. Ottomans know that it is a sacred duty to put down a rabid dog. Until now, the Ottoman Revolutionary Party has refrained from spilling blood, but it has now firmly resolved to punish the oppressors by force and avenge the victims. If the police or military try to block our path, only death will separate us from our cause. Yes, we will die, we will kill, we will cut, slash, burn, and destroy. We fear no one. Even the dynamite that will extinguish the monster Sultan's star and scatter its ashes to the sky is ready. Wherever the public good points, we will strike. Chanting truth or death, we will storm the parliament into session and uproot this tyrannical government from its core. This we declare. As the number of such societies grew, they also radicalized. Leading them was the Committee of Union and Progress, originally founded as the Ottoman Union Society in 1889 among students of the military medical school. The movement developed through propaganda and mergers, eventually adopting the name Committee of Union and Progress by 1907. CUP ideology rapidly spread among the officers of the Third Army stationed in Rumelia to combat banditry and guerrilla groups. These officers were directly confronting Bulgarian, Greek, and Serbian activities in Macedonia and its surroundings. A new event would soon galvanize the already oppositional CUP into decisive action. In June 1908, King Edward and Tsar Nicholas met in Reval. Their primary focus was the growing threat of Germany and Austria. Britain was alarmed by Germany's naval expansion, while Russia was concerned by its growing land forces. Austria's proposed Sanjak railway project, beginning in Novi Pazar, also stirred discontent in both Russia and Serbia. During the talks, the two monarchs also discussed Austria's activities in and around Macedonia. Edward and Nicholas reached full agreement on a plan to enforce reforms in Macedonia through the Ottoman Empire. However, both countries wished to avoid giving the impression that their meeting was an anti-German alliance. Thus, the post-meeting declarations emphasized only the Macedonian reforms. The spotlight on the Macedonia issue caused deep concern and panic among CUP members. The idea that European powers had decided to divide up the Ottoman Empire spread quickly. As a result, CQP concluded that the time had come to act and reform the Ottoman political system. Their response to the threat of imperial dissolution would be to restore constitutional governance. Sultan Abdul Hamid was closely monitoring COP activities in Macedonia through his agents. The committee, therefore, first sought to eliminate this surveillance network. They planned an assassination against Lieutenant Colonel Nazım Bey, the military commander of Thessaloniki and one of the Sultan's trusted men. Although Nazım Bey survived the attempt with injuries, the Sultan reacted harshly. He summoned and imprisoned 38 high-ranking officers from Thessaloniki and Manastir. This development alarmed the officers of the Third Army in Rumelia and pushed them to act. On July 3, 1908, in the town of Resna, Senior Captain Ahmed Niazi Bey took to the mountains with a group of volunteers and declared that he would not lay down arms until the Constitution was proclaimed. He justified his uprising with the following words: "All the people are drowning in a flood of emotions, waiting for the smallest spark, for a sincere act to ignite a general uprising. They awaited a model to emulate, a pioneering move." Niazi Bey's uprising marked the beginning of a major movement. Officers affiliated with the Committee of Union and Progress began opening weapons depots and distributing arms to the public. Sultan Abdul Hamid immediately dispatched one of his trusted men, Shemsi Pasha, to Monastir to suppress the unrest. Shemsi Pasha paused to send a telegram to the palace. In his message, he advised activating Albanian tribal leaders and inciting them to fight against the rebel officers defying the government. However, Shemsi Pasha was already being shadowed by a Karp assassin, Lieutenant Atif. As the Pasha was about to board his train, Lieutenant drew his weapon and shot him dead on the spot. Remarkably, the Albanian soldiers escorting Shemsi Pasha were not going to do much to catch the assassin. This assassination would dramatically shift the course of events. Shortly after the incident, another prominent unionist, Enver Bey, also fled to the mountains. Even Tatar Osman Pasha, who had been sent to replace Shemsi Pasha, would be captured and taken to the mountains by Niazi Bey's forces. Written propaganda was also being used to pressure the Sultan. 2 days after Niazi Bey's defection, the Monastir branch of the Committee of Union and Progress began posting declarations across the streets. These manifestos proclaimed the current government as illegitimate and demanded the restoration of the rule of law, meaning the reinstatement of the constitution. Though the language used was respectful toward the Sultan, the messages expressed unwavering resolve regarding the declaration of constitutional rule. Despite this mounting pressure, Sultan Abdul Hamid did not immediately yield. He initially sought to resist and consulted with several of his pashas. But in response to this hesitation, the CUP's Monastir branch unilaterally proclaimed the constitution on July 23rd. The Salonika headquarters joined this declaration in solidarity with Monastir. At that point, the Sultan realized that resistance was futile. Acknowledging the reality, he is reported to have said, "I am the one who first established the constitution. Since the nation now desires its restoration, I grant it once more." And so, on July 24th, 1908, the reinstatement of the 1876 Constitution was officially announced. But the constitutional regime would only bring more chaos to the Ottoman Empire. The proclamation of the constitution sparked immense joy across the country. The people had grown weary of Abdulhamid II's 33-year reign of autocracy. Now, freedom was returning to the land. The joy was so overwhelming that on July 24th, unaware of what the future would bring, the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but far darker days loomed on the horizon. COP, not wanting to appear as if it had staged a coup to seize power, refrained from taking over the post of Grand Vizier, but it also limited its involvement in the cabinet to only a few members. It sought to control and command governments from the outside, maintaining influence without appearing to rule directly. This approach would do little more than plunge the newborn regime into deeper chaos. Major crises were also beginning to emerge on the international stage. Amid the instability gripping the Ottoman Empire, the foreign ministries of Austria, Hungary, and Russia began to act. 5 months before the declaration of the Second Constitutional Era, Austria secured Ottoman approval for a railway project linking Sarajevo, Novi Pazar, Skopje, Salonika. In return, the Russians received assurances that Austria-Hungary would respect their interests in the Straits. While negotiations were still ongoing, Austria suddenly announced its annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a territory it had been administering on a temporary basis under the Treaty of Berlin. The annexation drew widespread condemnation from all major powers, and Europe began to sense the looming shadow of war. Outside the great powers, the harshest reaction came from neighboring Serbia, which had long eyed the provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Serbian newspapers that day called for a fight to the death against Austria. Serbian ministers publicly declared that war was now inevitable and urged the Serbian parliament to convene immediately, approve military spending, and begin mobilization preparations. Serbia's response created such a tense atmosphere across the continent that German Chancellor Bülow would later remark, "Europe has not been in such a state of excitement for years." Amid these rising tensions, even the Ottoman Empire's protest against the annexation faded from European attention. By December 1908, Austria had begun massing troops along the Serbian border. Europe was on the brink of a major war, but the anticipated explosion did not come. Serbia failed to secure the support it sought, either from Europe or from its powerful patron, Russia. While this crisis brought Europe to the brink of war, for the Ottoman Empire it was merely the beginning of the end. Prince Ferdinand of Bulgaria traveled to Budapest, where he was received by the Austrians as if he were a king. Austria, seeking to divert attention from its annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, encouraged the Bulgarians to declare independence. At a time when the Ottoman Empire was engulfed in constitutional chaos and preoccupied with the Bosnia issue, Ferdinand declared the establishment of an independent Kingdom of Bulgaria. Though the declaration of independence was not recognized by the Ottoman Empire, with Russian mediation, a settlement was reached whereby the Ottoman Empire would officially recognize the Kingdom of Bulgaria in exchange for financial compensation. The final blow of the 1908 crisis came from Crete. After the Greco-Ottoman War of 1897, the heir to the Greek throne had been appointed governor of Crete. The island had de facto fallen under Greek control, and its ties with the Ottoman Empire had become virtually non-existent. On the same day Austria annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina and Bulgaria declared independence, Crete also proclaimed its unification with the Kingdom of Greece. The blame for the territorial losses and growing political instability was placed squarely on the Committee of Union and Progress, which was seen as the driving force behind the constitutional regime. The reserve battalions stationed in the capital rose up in rebellion against the constitutional order and the Unionists. This reactionary uprising in Istanbul created the impression, particularly among COP branches and military units in Rumelia, that the constitution was in grave danger, and that efforts were underway to abolish it entirely. The commander of the Third Army in Salonika, Mahmud Şevket Pasha, acted swiftly and dispatched a division-sized force to Istanbul under the command of Hüseyin Hüsnü Pasha. After the Army of Action suppressed the rebellion, Sultan Abdülhamid II was deposed, accused of having ties to the uprising. For the Ottoman Empire, this moment marked another major turning point. With the enthronement of Sultan Mehmed Reshad, the era of powerful sultans came to an end. Real power would lie with the parliament, and increasingly, with the Committee of Union and Progress. As crises erupted across Ottoman territories and global tensions escalated, the worst days had yet to come for the Ottoman Empire. In North Africa, which had become a battleground for colonial powers, the empire held on to only a single remaining territory, Tripolitania. Lacking any land connection to the rest of the empire, was essentially Ottoman only on paper. And now it had become the target of a country that had entered the imperial race far too late. Italy, much like Germany, had completed its national unification only recently. Yet this young and ambitious state had no intention of abandoning its expansionist aspirations. It had already tested its colonial ambitions in Abyssinia, only to suffer a major defeat. In the years that followed, Italy shifted its focus to the Mediterranean, a more familiar and geographically closer region. For the Italians, the Ottoman Empire's last possession in the region, a perfect target. Exploiting the shifting balance of power in Europe, triggered by the Balkan crisis, Italy launched an invasion of Tripolitania in October 1911. The Ottoman Empire, which lacked a fully equipped army in the region, was caught off guard and found itself in a difficult position. A local resistance, organized with the help of volunteer Ottoman officers. In the summer of 1912, the Italians intensified their campaign, launching expeditions against the Dodecanese Islands in an effort to force the Ottomans out of the war. The empire, making one last desperate push to repel the Italians, remained unaware of the far greater catastrophe that loomed on the horizon. With the outbreak of the Italo-Turkish War, the geopolitical landscape began to shift once again. For the Balkan states, which harbored ambitions in Macedonia, the conflict in Tripolitania presented a critical opportunity. As the war began, the Ottoman Empire, fearing a possible Balkan uprising, had dispatched troops to Macedonia as a precaution. This move would push the Balkan powers to act sooner rather than later. At the time of the war's outbreak, Bulgarian Prime Minister Ivan Geshov was returning from a tour of Europe. He met with Serbian Prime Minister Milivoj Milovanović in Belgrade. During this meeting, the two leaders agreed on the foundations of a Serbo-Bulgarian alliance. A treaty of alliance was signed on March 13, 1912. Meanwhile, as Serbia and Bulgaria finalized their pact, talks also began between Greece and Bulgaria. Although these negotiations had initially stalled due to disagreements over Crete and Macedonia, they resumed after the Serbo-Bulgarian treaty was concluded. A Greek-Bulgarian alliance was also signed. With Serbia's support, Montenegro would soon join this alignment. The alliance, which would go down in history as the Balkan League, was built on shaky foundations. The treaties said almost nothing about how conquered Ottoman territories, especially Macedonia, would be divided in the event of victory. The agreements were vague and superficial, setting the stage for intense rivalry during the war itself. After the Balkan League was formed, the member states began looking for pretexts to declare war on the Ottoman Empire. Suddenly, Bulgarian guerrilla activity surged. Bombs began exploding in Macedonia. Their true objective was to launch war before the conflict with Italy ended, thereby catching the Ottomans off balance. Demonstrations erupted in Sofia, with protesters calling for war against the Ottoman Empire. The European powers, meanwhile, were closely monitoring developments in real time. The Russians hoped that the Balkan Alliance had been formed with the aim of preserving the regional status quo. They reached out to their French allies to determine France's stance in the event of war. During these talks, French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré reportedly stated, "Unless Germany initiates an attack, French public opinion will not support entering a war solely over Balkan issues. Do not count on France militarily in the Balkans. The British, taking a similar position, stated, "If Germany does not get involved, neither can we." Britain's primary concern was its colonial interests. The Italo-Turkish War, which involved an attack on Muslim territory, had already triggered a backlash among Muslim populations in British colonies, and openly supporting the Balkan states against the Ottoman Empire would only exacerbate these tensions. Moreover, Britain was wary of alienating the Ottomans and pushing them into Germany's orbit by taking an openly hostile stance. None of the European great powers truly wanted a war. However, in this tense atmosphere, none of them were willing to intervene directly, fearing they might unsettle the balance and provoke one another. This ambivalence and inaction would ultimately lead to disaster for the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. As relations with the Balkan states began to deteriorate in September, the Sublime Porte sought to delay the outbreak of war. The military situation was unfavorable. After the proclamation of the constitutional monarchy, a series of reforms and innovations had been initiated within the army. A systematic and large-scale purge was launched within the officer corps. Officers and pashas deemed politically problematic by the Unionists, especially those without formal military academy training, were removed. But due to Sultan Abdulhamid and the old guard of pashas, this purge had not been implemented. Now, at last, it was underway. Courses that had been banned during Abdulhamid's reign, such as Ottoman military history, irregular warfare, and political history, were reintroduced into the curriculum. Military students began receiving much more practical training. Large-scale maneuvers and live-fire exercises were organized, and new tactics and techniques were applied by the troops within realistic training scenarios. The modern weapons and equipment that had long been locked away in warehouses due to Abdulhamid's paranoia were now distributed to army units. Soldiers were able to develop their marksmanship skills on firing ranges. However, external events would prevent these structural reforms from being implemented in a healthy and comprehensive way. The reforms were well conceived, but poorly timed. Before the second year of reforms could be completed, Italy had invaded Tripolitania, and now, on the horizon, loomed the Balkan catastrophe. The state was completely unprepared for such a war. 70,000 experienced soldiers had just been discharged from the army. Many capable officers were either fighting in Tripolitania or on their way to join the war effort. Additionally, 29 battalions from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd armies had been dispatched to suppress a rebellion in Yemen. The Ottoman General Staff had been formulating its plans regarding the Balkan borders, which had been drawn by the Treaty of Berlin. For these territories, militarily indefensible against multiple enemy states, the war planning was built on the flawed assumption of a single-front war. The possibility of a Balkan alliance was a scenario the Ottomans did not even wish to imagine. As the war approached, the state's mobilization plans envisioned a 30-day process. But the Balkan states, having already completed their own mobilization and preparations, had no intention of allowing the Ottoman army time to prepare. The reinforcements from Anatolia had not even reached 50% of the projected numbers. The Greek navy had completely blocked sea transportation, and the single-track railway line could not handle the traffic. Despite these threats, Ottoman public opinion and army personnel wholeheartedly supported the war and the mobilization decision. Morale was high, and instead of focusing on defending the remaining provinces, many believed they would reclaim the territories previously lost. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and lofty expectations, the Ottoman Empire was dragged into a war for which it was utterly unprepared. The war began on October 8th, with an attack by Montenegro, and turned into a full Balkan war when the other allies issued a joint note on October 13th, demanding that Rumelia be divided into autonomous administrations based on ethnic principles. The war which would last only a short time, unfolded as a series of disasters. Unaware of the secret military and political agreements between Bulgaria and Serbia concerning the future of Macedonia, the Ottoman General Staff had deployed most of its forces not in Thrace, which would prove to be the primary front. The battle plans, flawed from start to finish in both design and execution, revealed their consequences in the very first days. Before the Eastern Army was even properly prepared, Minister of War Nazım Pasha ordered an attack. On October 22, 1912, the offensive began, but the troops were routed and forced to retreat to the Wiesbergus line. After regrouping to some extent, the army once again faced the Bulgarians in Luleburgaz on October 29th and suffered another defeat. The Western Army, meanwhile, was defeated by the Serbs at Kumanovo on October 23rd, retreating to Monastir. Political factions within the army, along with a lack of coordination and logistical support, pushed the Ottoman Empire into catastrophe within just a few weeks. With Greece joining the war, Thessaloniki was surrendered to the Greeks on November 8th, just 1 month after the declaration of war on October 8th, without a single shot being fired by Hasan Tahsin Pasha. Despite having over 20,000 soldiers stationed in the city, Tahsin Pasha surrendered it and would later be tried in absentia by a military tribunal for treason against the state. The Ottoman Empire was losing a city with each passing day. The Ottoman armies had suffered devastating defeats in Macedonia at the hands of the Balkan states. Only Edirne, Yarnia, and Shkodra remained under siege but still held out. The Bulgarian armies, having swiftly defeated the Ottoman forces in Thrace, pursued them as far as Çatalca, the final defensive line before Istanbul. On November 6, 1912, the Bulgarians resumed their advance, covering 15 kilometers per day for 6 days. Shorlu fell on November 7th, followed by Cherkasy on the 8th, Malkara on the 9th. Rejecting the Ottoman Empire's proposal for an armistice, the Bulgarians launched an offensive at Çatalca, aiming to capture Istanbul itself. In response, the Ottomans established their final line of defense at Çatalca to protect their capital. Only at this point was the mobilization process completed and the army reached the strength it had initially aimed for. The Battle of Çatalca was a fight for survival. If this line were breached, Istanbul would fall. The Bulgarian assault, which began on November 17th, resulted in intense combat. With more than 10,000 casualties, the Bulgarians were repelled, and the Ottoman forces secured a vital defensive victory, halting the enemy at the gates of the capital. Following this battle, the renewed armistice proposal was accepted by both sides, and in December 1912, negotiations began in London. The political climate within the Ottoman Empire was no less chaotic than the war itself. Even before the threat of war emerged, in July 1912, the CUCAP had been forced out of power due to the failures in the Tripolitanian War, and a new cabinet, led by Gazi Ahmet Muhtar Pasha, referred to as the Great Cabinet, was formed. But after a string of disasters in the first weeks of the Balkan War, this cabinet was also forced to resign. A new government was formed by Kemal Pasha, who assumed responsibility for managing the war effort. Yet, as defeats continued through November, the government was compelled to seek an armistice. One of the primary causes of the military failures was this political instability. Both the Great Cabinet and the Kemal Pasha government were built on public discontent toward the CUP. But with the outbreak of the Balkan War and the successive military disasters, public dissatisfaction began to shift in a very different direction. At this point, the Unionists once again intervened. After the armistice was signed, while peace terms were being discussed, the European powers began to pressure Istanbul to cede Edirne to Bulgaria. For the Ottoman Empire, Edirne held a uniquely important position, far beyond that of many other cities, known as the City of the Sultans. the idea of surrendering Edirne to the Bulgarians was a horrifying prospect for the Unionists. Amid this tense atmosphere, the Unionists decided to act. On January 23rd, while the Ottoman cabinet was convening in the Sublime Porte to discuss the official response regarding Edirne, rumors were swirling that the city would be handed over to the Bulgarians. Taking advantage of the moment, leading figures of the Committee of Union and Progress, Enver Bey, Yakub Shamil, Mustafa Necip, and Ermeneci, marched toward the government building. When Enver Bey and his group reached the outer hall, the chief aide to the Grand Vizier, Nafiz Bey, rushed out of his room, only to be shot and killed by the raiders. Shortly afterward, Kabrislazade Tevfik Bey, aide to the Minister of War, was also shot. To instill fear, they fired into the large windows of the hall, sending shattered glass crashing loudly to the ground. Minister of War Nazım Pasha, unaware of what was happening, ran outside to investigate. Meanwhile, the raiders killed Police Commissioner Jalal Bey, who was guarding the entrance, and stormed into the inner hall. As Nazım Pasha approached the Unionists and raised his voice in protest, he was shot in the temple and killed by Yakub Bey. Enver and Talat Beys then burst into the Grand Vizier's office. Enver Bey, with a stern tone, informed the Grand Vizier that the people no longer wanted him in office and demanded his resignation. Kamil Pasha, without saying a word, picked up a piece of paper and wrote his resignation to the Sultan, stating that he was compelled to resign at the request of the military. Enver and Talat Beys then insisted that he add the word people, revising the note to state that he was resigning at the request of the people and the army. A new government was formed under Mahmud Shevket Pasha, which responded to the Balkan League's memorandum. On January 30th, 1913, the government declared that Adrianople was inextricably linked to the Ottoman Empire and could not be ceded to anyone. Following the rejection of the Balkan states' demands, the armistice was annulled. While fighting continued at Çatalca, the Ottomans also landed troops at Şarkı, hoping to flank the Bulgarians and liberate Adrianople, but this operation also ended in failure. As the war turned increasingly disastrous for the Ottoman Empire, capital itself was once again under threat. In what would be known as the Second Battle of Çatalca, lasting from February to May 1913, the Ottoman army found itself with no remaining hope. One by one, the besieged cities fell. Yanya surrendered to the Greeks on March 6th, Adrianople fell to the Bulgarians on March 26th, and Ishkodra was taken by the Montenegrins on April 23rd. As peace talks resumed in London, the resulting Treaty of London was signed on May 30th, 1913. This agreement marked the end of centuries-long Ottoman presence in Rumelia. All Ottoman territories in the Balkans were ceded to the Balkan League states, and Albanian independence was officially recognized. However, from the very first days of the war, competition over Macedonia had already begun among the member states of what was called the Balkan League. The moment of distribution, left vague in pre-war alliances, had now arrived. Except for Montenegro, the remaining members of the League sought to fill the vast vacuum left behind by the Ottoman Empire's withdrawal from the Balkans and to claim the largest share of the spoils. What would go down in history as the Second Balkan War began barely a month after the ink had dried on the Treaty of London, which had ended the First War. A new coalition was quickly formed against Bulgaria, and Romania also joined in. Amidst all these developments, the Ottoman Empire did not hesitate to take advantage of Bulgaria's weakened position. On July 21st, Ottoman troops began marching toward Adrianople. They recaptured Lüleburgaz and Visa. Ottoman forces under the command of Enver Pasha entered Adrianople, bringing a sliver of solace after the catastrophe. The city of the Sultans had been reclaimed. The Balkan Wars, especially the rapid string of defeats in the First Balkan War, would cast a long shadow over the Ottoman Empire's future. the perception that the empire was collapsing became widespread across Europe. This perception whetted the appetites of foreign powers with ambitions on Ottoman lands. Among the Entente powers, discussions of dividing Ottoman territory had already begun. This was the general state of the Ottoman Empire. The Committee of Union and Progress had taken control of the state and would rule until the end of the World War. The mass atrocities committed by Balkan armies, resulting in the massacre of hundreds of thousands of people and the forced exile of survivors, barefoot and destitute, into Anatolia, left lasting trauma. And for the Turkish people, who longed for peace after a string of disasters, the only thing awaiting them was more war. The Great War was now at the doorstep. When the French declared war on Prussia in 1870, driven by dreams of a glorious victory, they had no idea they were creating a great monster with their own hands. From the very first days of the war, a string of disasters followed, and soon the Germans were at the gates of Paris. The sight of German armies gathered outside the city would stir not fear, but rather anger and shame among the French public. This war, which marked the end of the period known in French history as the Second Empire, and thus the fall of Napoleon III, would go on to shape the political course that would carry France toward the First World War. After the war, which led to the birth of the Third Republic, France spent the 1870s mired in political instability. Coup attempts and efforts to restore the monarchy plunged French politics into a state of chaos. According to the Treaty of Frankfurt, France would pay a war indemnity of 5 billion francs to the newly established German Empire. Yet it wasn't the financial losses that truly shocked the French. It was the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. For France, this region symbolized historical memory, cultural identity, and national pride. The trauma caused by this loss reverberated through every aspect of public life for years to come. On maps, Alsace-Lorraine was shaded out. In textbooks, it was placed within special frames. The loss of the war became the burning core of a new French spirit of vengeance. It came to represent the desire for revenge. But the driving force behind French politics was not just the lost provinces. The very existence of the new German Empire was enough to fundamentally alter a French foreign policy that had long relied on the disunity of German lands as a guarantee of security. After 1871, France sought to seize every opportunity it could to contain its newly powerful eastern enemy. The permanent hostility between France and Germany was becoming a fixed feature of the European international system. The size and military potential of the German Empire prompted France to orient its foreign policy toward building an anti-German alliance. And the most attractive candidate for such an alliance, despite its vastly different political system, was Tsarist Russia. If such an alliance could be realized, Germany would find itself threatened on two fronts by a potentially hostile coalition. France had two choices: to remain independent and rely solely on its own resources to face future dangers, or to form an alliance with the only partner available, Russia. While France was trying to make moves in foreign policy, it was also going through a highly chaotic period in domestic politics. The 1870s saw fierce struggles among various political factions, leading to deep divisions. Parts of the French right still longed for monarchy, while much of the left viewed the Republic as an empty shell. In its early years, the National Assembly was split between Bonapartists, Orleanists, Legitimists, and Republicans. Each faction held radically different visions for France's future. While monarchists awaited a return to the throne, the Republicans, particularly the radical wing, sought to enshrine secularism at the heart of the state. The fiercest battlefield in this political war became education policy. Starting in the 1880s, secular education laws began to restrict Catholic schools. The first major crisis to deeply shake the fledgling republic emerged within the military. In early 1886, General George Ernest Boulanger, a conservative monarchist with strong right-wing views, was appointed Minister of War. Known as General Revanche, Boulanger spoke directly to the conservative, monarchist and nationalist sentiments of the public. Emboldened by his growing popularity, Boulanger began provoking the Germans. He ordered the construction of military facilities near Belfort and banned the export of horses to German markets. He even advocated against public performances of Wagner's well-known opera Lohengrin. These actions contributed to growing strain between the two nations. In response, Germany took precautionary measures by mobilizing a large number of reservists in case of a potential crisis. Amid these rising tensions, a new incident added to the diplomatic strain. French officer Guillaume Schneibele was detained by German authorities near the border in Ars and Moselle, within the contested Alsace-Lorraine region. The event sparked disagreement over jurisdiction and deepened the existing discord. A diplomatic dispute erupted over which side of the border the arrest had taken place on, threatening to escalate into a military confrontation. Boulanger's inflammatory statements only heightened the situation, turning the matter into a personal clash between Bismarck and Boulanger. Although the crisis was diffused a week later with Schneibele's release, Boulanger's supporters hailed it as a personal victory over Bismarck. Boulanger was dismissed by Prime Minister René-Marie Goebel, a decision aimed at containing the growing political threat he posed. The movement that would later be known as Boulangism was gaining momentum, particularly within the military. Support came from various circles: soldiers, Bonapartists, monarchists, and segments of the population who had lost confidence in the Republic. When he was elected as a deputy from Paris in 1889, the country stood at a crossroads. Thousands of supporters expected him to run for the presidency or even seize power with the backing of the military. Yet, despite high expectations, Boulanger hesitated. His rapid rise in popularity began to fade just as swiftly. As his political momentum declined, authorities removed him from the public stage and sent him, along with his companion, to Jersey. A short time later, he moved to Belgium. But when his mistress died of tuberculosis, Boulanger fell into deep depression. At her grave in Ixelles Cemetery, south of Brussels, he put a gun to his temple and ended his turbulent life. But France's hysterical suspicion toward Germany would not end. This paranoia, which would shape both foreign and domestic policy, combined with rising anti-Semitism to trigger a new internal crisis. In the autumn of 1894, a French maid named Marie Bastien discovered a document known as the Bordereau in a waste bin at the German embassy. A note revealing that secret French military information had been passed to the German military attaché in Paris. Bastien, who was supposed to burn the attaché's waste, instead forwarded the note to Major Hubert Joseph Henry, hoping it might interest French intelligence. The army immediately launched a hunt for a spy. But it wasn't long before this turned into a search for a scapegoat rather than a proper legal investigation. Fueled by rising anti-Semitism, suspicion quickly fell on a Jewish captain, Alfred Dreyfus. Dreyfus was Jewish, born in Alsace, and spoke French with a German accent. In an era of growing anti-Semitism in France, his identity made him an easy target. Despite the absence of direct evidence, handwriting similarities were cited to accuse him. In truth, the handwriting on the bordereau belonged to another officer, Major Ferdinand Wolfson-Esterhazy. However, the army not only ignored this possibility, but refused to conduct a fair trial. Secret documents were submitted to the court without the defense ever seeing them. The hearings were held behind closed doors. In 1894, Dreyfus was convicted of high treason. The trial was driven not by law, but by institutional self-protection and anti-Semitic prejudice. On January 5th, a public degradation ceremony took place at the Moorland Court of the École Militaire in Paris. And to the sound of drums, Dreyfus stood before an official who formally delivered the court's decision. In accordance with military procedure, a Republican Guard officer removed his uniform insignia during an official ceremony. As he walked through the streets, some members of the crowd voiced strong reactions. Under intense public attention, Dreyfus was sent to lifelong exile on Devil's Island, located off the Atlantic coast. Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart, newly appointed as the head of military intelligence, reopened the case. After analyzing the available materials, he concluded that another officer, Major Ferdinand Wolfson-Esterhazy, was responsible for the security breach. Shortly after sharing his findings, Picquart was reassigned. Acknowledging mistakes in the original investigation became increasingly difficult for both political and military leadership. The Dreyfus affair caused significant division within French society. People were split between those who believed in Dreyfus's innocence and those who opposed revisiting the case. The writer Émile Zola emerged as a central figure by publishing his open letter, J'accuse, which drew national focus to the matter. In it, he accused the military of framing Dreyfus and highlighted the role of Major du Paty de Clam in the conspiracy. Zola's article caused a national uproar. Many intellectuals and artists joined him in calling for a retrial. Émile Duclos, Marcel Proust, Claude Monet, and Émile Durkheim. Due to his public position, Zola became the subject of a legal response. However, increased public interest and growing support for a new review helped bring renewed attention to the case. While the initial verdict remained in effect for a period, changes in the political climate in 1902 led to further examination of the matter as additional information came to light. Were forced to admit that the documents had been forged. Dreyfus was exonerated of treason. After years of exile and psychological torment, he was reinstated into the army with the rank of artillery major. He retired the following year, but returned to duty in 1914 when war broke out, participating in one of the bloodiest battles of the conflict, the Battle of Verdun. Yet the Dreyfus affair was more than just a judicial scandal. It was a turning point that exposed deep internal rifts in France. It laid bare the ongoing struggle between the military and civilian authority at the heart of the Third Republic, and the tension between secularism and religion. As a result of the affair, secularism would be redefined. The 1905 law on the separation of church and state, which sharply limited the church's role in public life, was a direct product of this polarization. As France faced a turbulent century ahead, the country was far from unified at home. While navigating this internal turmoil, France was also making vital moves in foreign policy. The 1894 military alliance, signed with Russia, marked the beginning of a new strategic direction. Since 1871, France had been working to construct an anti-German foreign policy. In the event of war, Germany would now face threats from both East and West. This alliance was also a political lifeline for France, which had endured years of diplomatic isolation in Europe. French capital began flowing into Russian railroads and industry. This was the first link in a new chain of alliances. The second step was to repair relations with Britain. Like France, Britain had ample reason to fear Germany. An alliance, or at least a rapprochement, with Britain would be highly beneficial for France. However, the two countries had been rivals for centuries, both in Europe and in the colonial world. Since the mid-19th century, both nations had expanded their interests in Southeast Asia. Britain, seeking to secure the eastern frontier of India and gain access to China from the south, was focused on regions such as Myanmar and Thailand. France, on the other hand, was expanding in Indochina. But as France pushed westward from Indochina toward Myanmar and India, it began to pose a threat to Britain. French expansion in the region was a clear signal that it intended to engage with both China and India. Egypt represented another flashpoint. The long-standing competition over control of Egypt intensified after the opening of the Suez Canal. The anti-foreign uprising, led by Urabi Pasha, drew both Britain and France deeper into the region. Although there were plans for joint intervention, the French government, wary of provoking Germany, chose not to take part. As a result, when Britain invaded in 1882, Egypt effectively became a British colony, though it was never formally recognized as such by France. During the same years, the colonial struggle was not limited to Asia and the Mediterranean. Europe was, in a sense, rediscovering Africa. In the mid-19th century, European explorers and adventurers began venturing beyond Africa's well-known coastal regions, such as the Cape of Good Hope and the North African shores, into the heart of the continent. The Scottish missionary and explorer David Livingstone began his African expeditions in 1840. Following the course of the Zambezi River, he became one of the first Europeans to cross the continent from west to east. In 1855, he introduced to Europe the massive waterfall known to locals as Mosi Tunya, today located on the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe, renaming it Victoria Falls. These discoveries received wide coverage in the European press and turned Livingstone into a heroic figure. When he disappeared during one of his journeys and went unheard from for years, journalist Henry Morton Stanley was dispatched to find him and would go on to continue his exploration. Between 1874 and 1877, Stanley explored the sources of the Nile and charted many of the Congo River's tributaries. His accounts of the Congo interior and its navigable waterways caught the attention of King Leopold II of Belgium. But these expeditions quickly became a trend across Europe. In particular, British exploration teams, figuratively speaking, tore through Africa's uncharted forests. As a result, Europe's growing knowledge of previously unknown regions whetted the appetites of many colonial powers. French explorers also started claiming land in the Congo Basin, igniting a scramble for territory. By backing Portugal's historical claims, France managed to gain control of the mouth of the Congo River. But the scramble for Africa was not limited to Britain and France. Other European powers soon joined the race. A crisis erupted as Britain gained advantages in the region. Belgium, France, and Germany refused to recognize Britain's dominance there. In fact, Bismarck had initially been skeptical of colonial ventures in Africa. In an 1882 speech before the Reichstag, he declared, "As long as I'm Chancellor, colonial policy is out of the question. We have no navy to speak of, and no means of holding overseas territories that would be seized by the French in the event of war." But the following year, under pressure from German merchants, Bismarck changed his position. In the winter of 1883–84, he sent a cruiser to the Gulf of Guinea to conduct a survey along the Cameroon coast. However, Germany's main interest lay in southwest Africa. German traders had been active in the region since the 1840s. Bismarck seized this opportunity and in 1884 declared that what would later be called German Southwest Africa was under German protection. German expeditions continued, leading to the annexation of Cameroon and later Togo. With the French, Belgians, Germans, British, and Portuguese all scrambling for land, Africa quickly became the symbol of new imperialism. As more and more territories fell under European control, tensions among the imperial powers escalated. At the invitation of King Leopold II and the initiative of Bismarck, Germany called for an international conference to discuss the African question. Held in Berlin in 1885, the conference produced the Berlin Act, formalizing what became known as the Scramble for Africa. One aim of this act was to shift European tensions to non-European territory. But this new arena of colonial competition would give rise to serious crises, particularly between the two pillars of European power, Britain and France. With the acceleration of colonial expansion, France pushed eastward from Senegal into the Sahara and Sudan. The key waterway connecting Senegal to Sudan was the Niger River. In 1883, the French established a presence at Bamako on the Niger. France's movement into this region alarmed the British, who had already entered Nigeria in 1879 and controlled much of the lower and middle Niger River. As France advanced along the river, Britain declared the area under its protection in 1887, effectively taking direct control. At the same time, Britain, France, and Germany clashed over the eastern coast of Africa. France sought to seize Madagascar, a territory with historically close ties to Britain. In response, Britain encouraged the local rulers to resist French influence. Likewise, the French worked to undermine Britain in Zanzibar and its surrounding regions. The most dangerous crisis between the two powers, however, unfolded in Fashoda. In May 1894, Britain signed a treaty with the Congo Free State, leasing territory stretching as far north as Fashoda. This effectively placed the Congo Free State between Sudan and French Congo. But since this corridor sat between the Congo Free State and German East Africa, both France and Germany objected to the agreement. France, claiming that Sudan was still legally Ottoman territory, insisted that Britain had no authority to make such a deal. With German support, France succeeded in forcing Britain to abandon the treaty. Nevertheless, it had become clear that the next major goal of British imperialism was the conquest of Sudan. Securing the route to India was a matter the British government would not gamble on. In March 1896, a joint British-Egyptian force of 20,000 men under Lord Kitchener set out and captured Dongola. They began constructing a railway southward and slowly advanced. Later, they seized Kassala, then under Italian control, and gained control over the Blue Nile. Though the campaign was temporarily halted due to disease, the offensive resumed in 1898. After defeating local forces, the British reached Fashoda in September 1898, only to receive a shock. As the British approached from the north, the French, led by Captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand, had been advancing from the south. Marchand had reached Fashoda 2 months earlier and raised the French flag over the fort. In a surprising twist, the meeting between the two forces was marked by unusual cordiality. Kitchener and Marchand agreed to wait for orders from their respective governments. So cordial was the encounter that the two men reportedly shared whiskey, with Marchand later joking that drinking, "It had been one of the greatest sacrifices I ever made for my country." In the immediate aftermath of the Fashoda encounter, diplomatic steps were taken. The Dreyfus affair was still shaking France from within. The British distributed French newspapers to French soldiers, warning that France was in no condition to fully support Marchand and his troops. During the crisis, Britain maintained a firm and confident stance. In his memoirs, Edward Grey wrote, "It appeared that the French commander who had planted his flag would only yield to force. That meant war between France and Britain. It was impossible for Britain to accept any foreign claim over the Nile Valley. There was only one thing to do: to demand the withdrawal of French forces. While Britain remained determined, French Foreign Minister Théophile Delcassé faced intense pressure from the French public over the Fashoda issue. On September 27th, Delcassé told the British ambassador, "If there are no negotiations, conflict will be inevitable. Do not corner me." But Britain paid no heed to these pleas and instead increased its pressure. Faced with this reality, France could not risk war with Britain. In November 1898, ordered General Marchand to withdraw from Fashoda. A colonial war between Britain and France had been narrowly averted through France's retreat. As the number of African colonial crises grew, tensions between European powers deepened. France entered the 20th century beset by both internal and external turmoil. Foreign Minister Delcassé sought to expand France's alliances to counter the rising power of Germany. Strengthening the 1894 Franco-Russian alliance and adding Britain to it became a crucial objective for France. Delcassé's willingness to de-escalate the Fashoda crisis and reconcile with Britain marked the first serious step in ending decades of estrangement between the two countries. With the death of Queen Victoria, her son Edward VII ascended to the throne. Edward was a noted Francophile. He had spent much of his life in Paris and on the French Riviera, spoke and deeply admired French culture. Upon becoming king, he expressed regret over the strained Anglo-French relations and actively sought rapprochement. History would soon assist his efforts. Prime Minister Salisbury, a staunch isolationist, resigned and was replaced by Lord Balfour. Anti-French politicians who had previously advocated an alliance with Germany began losing influence, while moderates more open to France rose to power. Delcassé, who had become foreign minister in June 1898, had openly stated that his primary goal was reconciliation with Britain. According to him, if France wished to expand its colonial empire and one day reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, it would need to end its century-old hostility toward Britain. In the words of Napoleon, reconciliation with perfied Albion, perfidious Albion, had become necessary. Beginning in mid-1902, talks between the two sides grew warmer. Within this climate, King Edward VII visited Paris on his own initiative. He was not warmly welcomed at first. At the initial reception, the crowd shouted slogans like "Long live the Boers," "Long live General Marchand," and "Long live Fashoda." But the king's charming and diplomatic demeanor quickly softened the mood. He declared, "I am certain that the days of hostility between our two countries are over. I know of no other nations whose prosperity is so closely tied. There may have been disagreements and grievances in the past, but thankfully, they are behind us. The friendship of our two nations has always been a cherished hope of mine." Following these remarks, the warmth and hospitality shown toward Edward VII began to erase the bitter memories between the nations. The king's speeches increasingly emphasized Franco-British friendship. Interestingly, his visit to Paris was followed by a trip to Berlin, as he was making a diplomatic tour of European capitals. Germany's ambassador in Paris, in a report to Berlin, downplayed the visit, insisting that any Anglo-French rapprochement would be neither sincere nor lasting. But the Germans were mistaken. In July 1903, French President Émile Loubet, accompanied by Delcassé, paid a reciprocal visit to Britain. Discussions between Delcassé and British Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne during this visit would bear fruit 8 months later. President Loubet declared, "France holds your visit to Paris as a cherished memory. I am confident it will yield the happiest results and will serve greatly to strengthen relations between our two nations, to our mutual benefit and for the peace of the world." At that time, the main obstacle to full reconciliation was the issue of Morocco. Since seizing Algeria in 1830, France had taken a keen interest in Moroccan affairs. Morocco's strategic location at the mouth of the Mediterranean had drawn the attention of many European powers. Italy, having lost Tunisia to France, turned its gaze toward Morocco, but France managed to deflect Italian interest by allowing Italy a free hand in Tripolitania. Meanwhile, Britain, having long viewed France as a rival, was unwilling to see Morocco fall under French influence. At the same time, Germany was also interested in Morocco as a potential colony on the Atlantic coast, a market for exports, a source of iron ore, and a potential naval base. German appetite was growing. After the loss of Egypt and Sudan, France turned its eyes to Morocco as compensation. This strategic shift brought France and Britain back to the negotiating table. Britain entered the 20th century engaged on multiple fronts, fighting the Boer War in Africa, engaged in a naval arms race with Germany, and seeking to contain Russian expansion in the Mediterranean. The age of splendid isolation was nearing its end. Britain now needed a reliable partner, and France was that partner. It was in this context that the Entente Cordiale was born. The agreement ended the long-standing colonial disputes between the two powers. France pledged not to obstruct British actions in Egypt, while Britain recognized France's right to maintain order and implement reforms in Morocco. The colonial rivalry in the Mediterranean was effectively resolved. The Entente Cordiale did not, by itself, create a formal alliance between Britain and France, but it did mark the end of nearly 1,000 years of intermittent hostility. For France, the agreement was especially significant. It marked the final end of its diplomatic isolation since 1871. Anglo-French relations, strained since the Crimean War, were finally beginning to thaw. And this was only the first step. The next was rapprochement with Russia. Throughout the 19th century, Britain and Russia had been bitter imperial rivals. Since the early 1800s, Russia had pushed into Persian territory, threatening British interests in India through the Iran-Afghanistan corridor. After the disaster of the Crimean War, Russia turned its expansionist ambitions eastward. In Central Asia, Russian efforts accelerated. The Turkic Khanates became the next targets of Tsarist policy. Russia seized Chimkent in 1864, Tashkent in 1865, and established the Governorate General of Turkestan in 1867. It captured Samarkand in 1868, moved against Khiva in 1873, annexed the Kokand Khanate in 1876, and seized Merv in 1884. Russian activities in Tibet raised serious alarm in London. As Russia expanded across Central and East Asia, Britain's anxieties grew. Russia's expansion through Siberia into the Far East would soon prompt a reaction from Britain. When Japan, the rising power in East Asia, defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894, its growing influence alarmed the European powers. Germany, Russia, and France intervened to limit Japan's gains. Britain, however, refused to join this intervention. As a result, relations between Britain and Japan started to warm. It was inevitable that Russia's imperial ambitions in the Far East would eventually clash with those of Japan. Britain, in turn, had finally found a partner capable of teaching the Russians a lesson in Asia. In January 1902, Britain and Japan signed an alliance treaty, marking the end of Britain's splendid isolation. The alliance would soon bear fruit. When the Russo-Japanese War broke out in 1904, Britain did not officially participate, but it provided Japan with crucial support, especially in intelligence and espionage. British agents disrupted Russian communications, giving Japan a significant strategic advantage. During the conflict, Britain also intercepted secret correspondence between Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas II, revealing Germany's attempts to push Russia into war against Britain. The war ended in a devastating defeat for Russia, which would deeply affect its future foreign policy. Russia found itself in complete diplomatic isolation. Wherever it tried to expand its influence, whether in Asia or abroad, it encountered British resistance. France, meanwhile, proved unable to support Russia meaningfully. The Tsarist regime, adrift and alone, was further destabilized by internal unrest, culminating in the 1905 revolution. This domestic turmoil marked a turning point in Russian diplomacy. Alexander Izvolsky abandoned the far eastern ambitions of his predecessor, Vladimir Lambsdorff, and instead sought reconciliation with Russia's rivals. The Tsarist regime made a swift pivot away from East Asia, choosing instead to focus on European politics, which it deemed more in line with its historical and strategic interests. Adding to Russia's concerns was the growing German influence in the Ottoman Empire. With the Berlin-Baghdad railway project, Germany was expanding toward the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. France and Britain had previously attempted joint negotiations to limit this expansion, but these talks had failed. For Russia, this meant that dangerous isolation was no longer just a possibility, it had become a reality. At the same time, Britain began viewing the prospect of a rapprochement with Russia more favorably. In late 1905, British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey stated, "If Russia sincerely and wholeheartedly accepts our intent to maintain peaceful control over our Asian possessions, then I am confident that no British government will seek to obstruct Russia's policies in Europe. Quite the opposite. We would welcome the restoration of Russia's position and influence in the European concert." In a letter to the Russian ambassador, Grey went even further. "It is not for us to propose changes to the treaty conditions regarding the Dardanelles. But if Russia does so, we consider such changes acceptable and would be ready to discuss them." As a result of this strategic shift, Izvolsky proposed a formal agreement to Britain in October 1906. This was precisely the initiative the British Foreign Office had been waiting for. While negotiations continued, a Russian naval fleet paid a visit to Portsmouth. And at King Edward VII's invitation, a delegation of Russian sailors came to London. After the seemingly impossible Anglo-French entente, the Anglo-Russian rapprochement was now taking shape. Following these diplomatic overtures, the two countries signed an agreement in August 1907. Like the Entente Cordiale, the accord focused on colonial spheres of influence. Russia pledged to end all direct involvement in Afghanistan and agreed to conduct all relations via Britain. In return, Britain promised not to invade or annex Afghanistan. Northern Persia, the most populous and economically vital region, would fall under Russian influence. The southeast, a barren and desert-filled region containing the routes from Persia to India, will belong to the British sphere. The central region between them was designated as neutral, and both sides agreed not to seek advantage there without mutual consent. Britain was more than satisfied with the agreement. On paper, we both gained, but in practice, we gave up nothing. Our gains were real. Russia's were only apparent. And thus, the foundations of the Triple Entente between France, Britain, and Russia were laid. By resolving their long-standing disputes, the three powers grew closer and began coordinating their foreign policies. No longer constrained by competing colonial interests. As the storm of Great War loomed on the horizon, the Entente secured its footing. And now, only the spark remained. On June 11, 1903, during the early hours of the morning, a group of uniformed officers arrived at the Royal Palace in Belgrade. Records indicate that entry was made into the palace and certain individuals were present inside at the time. The interior was dimly lit, and the overall setting remained quiet. This date would later be noted as marking a change in Serbia's political leadership and direction. The assassination of King Alexander and Queen Draga inside the palace marked not only a change in power, but also a deep rupture that would shape Serbia's future. Carried out by young officers, the assassination brought an end to one dynasty and elevated another to the throne. More importantly, it opened the gates to a new era and paved the way for a shadowy organization growing in the dark. When the gunfire inside the palace finally ceased that night, the streets didn't fall into silence. They erupted in jubilant celebration, adorned with flags. Even Britain's ambassador in Belgrade was stunned by the festive atmosphere. The king's lifeless body had been thrown from beneath a window, stabbed repeatedly along with the queen. The palace was bathed in blood, yet the people of Belgrade received this brutality almost as a ritual of purification. The assassination on June 11th would become one of the most profound turning points in Serbian political history. The Obrenović dynasty, which had ruled Serbia for much of its brief life as an independent state, had now been eradicated. Just hours later, the conspirators announced that the Obrenović line was no more, and that the Karađorđević dynasty, until then exiled in Switzerland, would take its place. The new king, Petar I, was a liberal educated in France and Switzerland. But what had caused such a ruthless reckoning with the Obrenović family? The dynasty had failed to establish a stable institutional structure in Serbia. The root of the problem partly lay in the continued existence of a rival house. The two major houses had both emerged during Serbia's struggle for independence from the Ottoman Empire. The founder of the Karađorđević line was Black George, or Karađorđe, a former cattle herder and a dark-complexioned man who launched a successful rebellion against the Ottomans in 1804 that lasted several years. However, when the Ottomans counterattacked, he was forced to flee to Austria in 1813. 2 years later, a second uprising began under Miloš Obrenović, a moderate politician negotiating Serbia's autonomy with Ottoman authorities. When Karađorđe returned from exile, he was assassinated on Obrenović's orders with Ottoman consent. With his greatest rival eliminated, Obrenović was granted the title of Prince of Serbia. In 1882, Milan Obrenović declared the Kingdom of Serbia 4 years after securing independence at the Congress of Berlin. But throughout the century, Serbia remained plagued by instability. Coups and dynastic changes occurred repeatedly. By the early 1880s, a modern political culture had begun to emerge in Serbia through newspapers, party meetings, manifestos, and local committees. King Milan responded to this new and unpredictable public force with authoritarian measures. In the 1883 elections, a rival majority formed in the Serbian parliament, Skupština. Rather than appointing a government from the victorious Radical Party, King Milan installed a cabinet composed of bureaucrats. The Skupština was opened by royal decree and closed again 10 minutes later by another. His refusal to consult his ministers or parliament led to war with Bulgaria in 1885, which ended in disaster. Milan's throne began to shake. In 1889, he was deposed, and his son Alexander Obrenović ascended the throne. But Alexander was only 12 years old, and it was still his father who truly ruled from behind the scenes. At first, Alexander reigned under a regency composed of statesmen. But in 1893, he staged a radical coup to rid himself of the regents. One evening, he invited the ministers to dinner. As glasses were being raised, he suddenly declared they were all under arrest. The young king announced that he was seizing full authority. The next morning, the people of Belgrade awoke to see posters plastered across the city declaring Alexander's takeover. But the mastermind behind the coup was none other than Milan. Though officially abdicated, the father remained his son's chief advisor. During Alexander's reign, the fate of the Obrenović dynasty began to take shape. Overshadowed by his father, Alexander would soon exhaust the brief hopes that had emerged. His downfall was set in motion by a disastrous marriage decision. He wished to marry Draga Mojin, the widowed wife of a deceased engineer with a questionable reputation. Draga, who was 10 years older than the king, disliked by Belgrade's high society and known to have had relationships with many men, triggered a political crisis. The Minister of the Interior, Georgi Genchit, went to extreme lengths to stop the marriage. "Your Majesty, you cannot marry her. She's been the mistress of many men, including myself," he said. The response to this boldness was a slap across the face. He would later become involved in the conspiracy against the king. The political establishment opposed this marriage with near fanatical resolve. When news of the couple's engagement broke, the entire cabinet resigned. To continue governing, Alexander had to form a new wedding cabinet, composed of lesser-known figures. Even his father reacted harshly. Upon hearing that Draga would become his daughter-in-law, Milan was so enraged that he resigned from his post as commander-in-chief. In a letter to his son dated June 1900, Milan wrote that Alexander had brought Serbia to the edge of the abyss, and that if anyone ever exiled him for such foolishness, he would be the first to congratulate them. But nothing could steer Alexander from his path. By 1903, he'd become a thoroughly unwanted figure. The Radical Party, which had won an overwhelming majority in the elections, strongly disliked the king's autocratic methods. Its members believed that the Vienna-centered foreign policy of the Obrenovics had locked Serbia's economy into dependence on Austria, preventing Serbian capitalists from accessing global markets. On April 6, 1903, a protest was held in Belgrade to oppose the king's disregard for the constitution. It was dispersed by police and gendarmerie using force. 10 demonstrators were killed, around 50 were injured, and more than 100 people, including some officers, were arrested and imprisoned. At the center of the growing hostility toward the monarchy stood the army. At the turn of the 20th century, the military was the most dynamic institution in Serbian society. In a country with a weak, agriculture-based economy and limited opportunities for upward mobility, becoming an officer was one of the surest paths to status and influence. This reality was reinforced when King Milan increased the military budget and expanded the officer corps at the expense of higher education. But those days ended when King Father Milan left the country in 1900. Alexander cut the military's budget again. Officers' salaries were delayed for months. Advancement in the army now required personal connections to the king, the queen, or their associates. It was in this climate that the army began preparing for an assassination. One of the key figures within the military was Dragutin Dmitrievich, a man seemingly born for political intrigue. Deeply committed to his duties, ruthless and calm in moments of crisis, Dmitrievich, known by the nickname Apis, was not someone who could rally mass movements. But he excelled within small groups and secret circles. He was skilled at recruiting men, establishing authority over his followers, deflecting suspicion, and steering people toward extreme actions. Apis planned to assassinate the royal couple on Queen Draga's birthday at a ball in the center of Belgrade. However, the plan failed. Over the next 2 years, the conspirators expanded the scale of their operation. They recruited over 100 officers. Eventually, it was decided that the king and queen would be eliminated in their own palace. Such a plan required meticulous preparation. The king and queen had, understandably, become extremely paranoid and had tightened security. The king refused to leave the palace without a large entourage. Draga was so fearful for her life that at one point, she didn't step outside the palace for 6 weeks. It was in such an environment that Alexander and Draga were assassinated. Petar Karađorđević emerged from exile and promised the people that he would be a constitutional Serbian king. Yet, although the coup had resolved some of the old problems, it also introduced several new and significant ones on the road to 1914. The network of conspirators who had come together to kill the king and queen did not dissolve. Instead, it maintained a powerful presence in Serbian politics and public life. In the Provisional Revolutionary Government, formed the day after the assassinations, 4 conspirators and 6 party-affiliated politicians were included. Dragutin himself was formally thanked by the National Assembly for his actions, a clear reference to the assassination, and was hailed as a national hero. Austria's ambassador in Belgrade wrote to Vienna that although the king had been elected by the assembly, he remained a hostage to those who brought him to power. At the end of November, Count Mary von Kappos of the Austro-Hungarian Foreign Ministry remarked, "The king is nothing more than a puppet. All real power lies in the hands of the men who carried out June 11th. Count Mary was right. The balance of power in Serbia had shifted. The difficult task of managing this unruly group largely fell to the Radical Party leader, Nikola Pasic. After the coup, he became the most influential statesman in the country. Between 1904 and 1918, he would serve as prime minister in 10 cabinets over 9 years. Serbia was in turmoil. Governments were changing, thrones were being shaken by coups, but for the Serbs, one thing remained constant: the Nasrtanije. The Nasrtanije was a secret document prepared in 1844 by Serbia's Minister of the Interior, Ilija Garajanin, for Prince Alexander. It became the Magna Carta of Serbian nationalism. Garajanin began the text by declaring that Serbia is small, but it will not remain so. According to the Nasrtanije, the main priority of Serbian politics should be the realization of national unity. Garajanin proclaimed, "Wherever a Serb lives, that is Serbia." He based this vision of Serbian expansion on the medieval empire of Stefan Dušan. Although Dušan's empire collapsed after a defeat against the Turks at the Battle of Kosovo on June 28, 1389, Garajanin argued that this defeat did not nullify the legitimacy of the Serbian state. No one can accuse us of rebelling for something new and unfounded. On the contrary, everyone must acknowledge this as a political necessity, an ancient truth deeply rooted in the national and political life of the Serbian people. Garajanin was fully aware that this long-term program of unification and expansion would require confrontation with 2 empires that controlled the territories of Greater Serbia, the Ottomans and the Austrians. The ideal of recovering the lost, Serbian lands became even more entrenched due to Serbia's exposed geographical position between 2 great imperial powers. There was an idea of restoring Greater Serbia, but where should the expansion begin? From Vojvodina, under Hungarian rule, from Ottoman Kosovo, known as Old Serbia, from Bosnia, where many Serbs lived, though it had never been part of Dušan's empire, or from Macedonia in the south, still under Ottoman control. The goals of unification were grand, but Serbia's financial and military resources were limited. There was a wide gap between dream and reality. That gap left Serbia's leaders in Belgrade with little choice but to act opportunistically within the ever-shifting dynamics of the Balkans. Thus, Serbia's objectives kept changing. During the revolutions of 1848, Serbia supported the Serbs in Vojvodina under Hungarian control. When the Serbs rose against the Ottomans in 1875, all eyes turned to Herzegovina. After a failed revolt against the Ottomans in 1903, the desire to liberate the Serbs in Ottoman Macedonia grew even stronger. Serbian politics functioned on improvised decisions made in response to each situation as it unfolded. While affairs in Serbia remained volatile, neighboring Austria-Hungary was not in much better situation. In 1859, the combined forces of France and Piedmont defeated the Habsburgs, paving the way for the new Italian nation-state. 7 years later, the weary monarchy of Central Europe was once again defeated, this time by the Prussians at the Battle of Königgrätz. The shock of these 2 defeats deeply affected the Austrian state and its politics. Shaken by military disasters, the absolutist Austrian Empire was transformed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Under the Compromise of 1867, power was divided between two dominant nations. Both parts had their own parliaments, but there was no joint prime minister or council of ministers. Only foreign affairs, defense, and the defense-related parts of the treasury were entrusted to joint ministers, who reported directly to the emperor. Issues of common concern to the entire empire were not debated in joint parliamentary sessions, as doing so would imply that the Kingdom of Hungary was part of a broader imperial structure. Instead, delegations of 30 members from each parliament met alternately in Vienna and Budapest to exchange views. However, this dual system provoked backlash on both sides. For hardline Hungarian nationalists, it was a scheme designed to deny Hungary full independence. Some argued that Austria continued to exploit Hungary as a kind of agricultural colony. Vienna's refusal to share control over the armed forces or to create an equal Hungarian army only heightened tensions. On the other hand, Austro-Germans claimed that the Hungarians were living off the more economically advanced Austrian lands and needed to bear an equal share of the empire's financial burden. Conflict was inevitable. According to the compromise, the two halves of the empire had to renegotiate the customs union and the distribution of revenue and taxes every 10 years. With each new negotiation, Hungarian demands grew. By the pre-war period, the empire, if not politically, had become deeply fragmented along ethnic lines. It officially recognized 11 nationalities. The demands for national rights from Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Ruthenians, Poles, and Italians were steadily increasing. The way these demands were handled differed between the empire's two halves. Hungarians generally tried to solve the nationality problem by pretending it didn't exist. Only about 6% of the kingdom's population had the right to vote, as the franchise was based on property ownership and thus favoured the wealthy Hungarian elite. Moreover, from the late 1870s onward, the Hungarian government pursued an aggressive policy of Magyarization. Education laws required the use of Hungarian in all public and religious institutions. All teachers were expected to speak fluent Hungarian and were to be dismissed immediately if found hostile to the Hungarian state. Despite all this, Austria-Hungary managed to maintain its unity up until the eve of the Great War. The prestige and continuity of the monarchy seemed to reside in the person of Emperor Franz Joseph. Emperor's life was marked by personal tragedies. His son, Crown Prince Rudolf, committed suicide with his mistress at the family's hunting lodge. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, was stabbed to death on the shores of Lake Geneva by an Italian anarchist. His brother, Maximilian, was executed by Mexican rebels in Querétaro. And his favorite nephew died in a fire after his clothes caught flame from a cigarette. The emperor endured all these tragedies with remarkable composure. Outwardly cold and stoic, he became known for his repeated phrase at nearly every official event, "It was good, we were quite satisfied." These words became so iconic that they turned into a common saying, used in households and everyday life throughout the empire. Despite ongoing turmoil, the empire managed to project a sense of stability. Even during crises, the system seemed to endure without collapsing. The situation resembled the description by Viennese journalist Karl Kraus. It was terrible, but not hopeless. By the end of the 19th century, the Habsburgs' relations with their neighbours were more stable than their internal affairs. The primary source of tension lay in southeastern Europe, where the weakening of Ottoman authority had created a power vacuum and overlapping spheres of interest for two major powers, Austria-Hungary and Russia. Both believed they had a historical claim to the lands the Ottomans were withdrawing from. The Habsburg dynasty saw itself as the traditional guardian of Europe against the Turks. Russia, meanwhile, promoted pan-Slavism and claimed a shared destiny with the Slavic peoples of the Balkans. As the Ottoman retreat continued, the strategic issue of control over the Turkish Straits also came to the forefront. At the dawn of the new century, it appeared that the dangerous game between the great powers had been brought under control. In 1881, the Three Emperors League, signed between Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany, contained a clause in which Russia respected Austria-Hungary's occupation of Bosnia-Herzegovina as ratified by the Treaty of Berlin. Further talks between Austria and Russia in 1897 reaffirmed their joint commitment to preserving the status quo in the Balkans. But the Balkans were a pressure cooker, not easily cooled by handshakes between empires. The smaller states in the region also needed to be appeased. For Vienna, the most important of these was the Kingdom of Serbia. During the long reign of pro-Austrian King Milan Obrenović, Serbia had remained a compliant partner, voicing no objections to Austria-Hungary's claims of regional dominance. In return, Vienna supported Belgrade's elevation to kingdom status in 1882 and even promised to back Serbia's expansion eastward into Ottoman Macedonia. But Milan's son, Alexander, proved far more erratic in his behavior toward the Habsburgs. Trusting in the support Austria-Hungary had shown his kingdom, Alexander went so far in 1899 as to declare, "Serbia's enemies are also enemies of Austria-Hungary." This misstep caused discomfort in St. Petersburg and was seen as an embarrassment for Vienna. Still, Alexander found the advantages of a pro-Russian policy increasingly attractive. After the death of his father in 1902, he openly sought Russian assistance, even telling a journalist in St. Petersburg that the Habsburgs were Serbia's arch-enemy. Unsurprisingly, his assassination would not cause much grief in Vienna. The real breaking point in Austro-Serbian relations came with the 1903 coup. Although Austria-Hungary was the first to officially recognize the new Serbian regime in an effort to establish good relations, reconciliation would prove nearly impossible. The new government in Belgrade was openly hostile to the Habsburgs. In Vienna, officials watched with growing unease as the nationalist press, now free from government restrictions, spewed anti-Austrian rhetoric. In September 1903, Austria's envoy in Belgrade reported that relations between the two countries were as bad as they could possibly be. As a result, Vienna decided to officially condemn the coup and, together with Britain, imposed sanctions on Serbia. Russia, seeking to exploit the deteriorating ties between Belgrade and Vienna, urged the Serbian government not to renew its trade agreement with Austria-Hungary, insisting instead that Serbia's future lay westward along the Adriatic coast. This tension came to a head at the end of 1905 when Austria-Hungary discovered that Serbia and Bulgaria had signed a secret customs agreement. But this was not the only issue. Negotiations for a loan between Vienna and Belgrade had stalled. Serbia began turning to France instead, and soon arranged to purchase weapons from the French arms company Schneider, rather than Austria's Skoda works in Bohemia. At the beginning of 1906, these moves by Belgrade led to what would become known as the Pig War. Austria-Hungary imposed a trade embargo on Serbia, effectively cutting off the export of Serbian goods to the empire. But the embargo backfired. The Serbs quickly found alternative markets for their products. The real breaking point between Austria and Serbia came with the Bosnian crisis of 1908. For a time, Russia, eager to expand in the Balkans after pursuing colonial ambitions in the Far East, had reached a temporary understanding with Austria. But after the disastrous defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Russian foreign policy returned its focus to traditional spheres of interest, the Balkans and the Turkish Straits. Seeking renewed influence, Russia resumed contact with Austria over Balkan matters, only to be outmaneuvered. After the Reval meetings, the Russians were hopeful that their aspirations concerning the Straits might materialize. However, this would require negotiations and concessions with Austria. Russian Foreign Minister Alexander Izvolsky sent a letter to his Austrian counterpart, Alois Ehrenthal, proposing a friendly spirit of reciprocity. In exchange for opening the Turkish Straits to Russian ships, Austria-Hungary would be allowed to annex Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Sanjak of Novi Pazar. Ahrenthal's response was not negative. He agreed to the proposal in principle. Both ministers decided to meet, though neither wished to travel to the other's capital. Instead, they convened at Buchlau Castle in Moravia, the residence of Austria's ambassador to Russia, Count Berchtold. However, the outcome of the talks remained a verbal agreement. Izvolsky accepted the responsibility of formalizing the results in writing. But 6 weeks passed, and no memorandum had been produced. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, had its own reasons to act swiftly. After the declaration of constitutional rule in the Ottoman Empire, rumors spread that the Young Turks intended to organize elections across all Ottoman lands, including those under Austrian occupation, which lacked their own representative institutions. Empowered by revolutionary momentum, the new Ottoman administration could demand the return of its western territories and promise constitutional reform to the people of Bosnia-Herzegovina, creating a serious problem for Vienna. Moreover, local political movements within Bosnia were beginning to demand autonomy. Austria faced a now or never scenario. Believing the diplomatic groundwork had been laid, the Austro-Hungarian government announced the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina on October 5, 1908. Though the move was expected to strain relations with the Ottoman Empire, the real crisis erupted between Vienna and Belgrade. Serbian newspapers published special afternoon editions accusing Austria of violating the Treaty of Berlin and called for a life-or-death war against the empire. Serbian ministers publicly declared that war was inevitable and began trying to rally European powers to their side. The Serbian National Assembly convened urgently and approved military spending. Mobilization preparations began, and plans were made to form militant committees in the region. Crown Prince Alexander and Radical Party leader Nikola Pasic departed immediately for Russia to seek help from the Tsar. Serbia's foreign ministry declared Bosnia-Herzegovina to be the heart of the future South Slav kingdom and launched a diplomatic campaign across European capitals to stop Austria. The initiative launched by Russia turned into a political fiasco for all involved. Serbia's hopes were crushed. Russian Foreign Minister Izvolsky bluntly told the Serbian ambassador in Paris, "Surely you Serbs don't believe you can drive Austria out of Bosnia-Herzegovina by force. And we are certainly not about to go to war with Austria over those provinces. So I fail to see what all the excitement is about." Russia hesitated to fully support Serbia in this crisis, and with good reason. Although it appeared to be a clash between Vienna and Belgrade, it was, in essence, a confrontation between Berlin and St. Petersburg. Germany, pursuing the same "we stand with Vienna" policy that would later lead to the Great War, supported Austria during the crisis. A few months after the annexation, in March 1909, Germany cornered Russia diplomatically. Berlin demanded a clear and definitive answer, either yes or no, on whether Russia accepted the annexation. Failure to respond positively would prompt Germany to withdraw from negotiations and allow events to unfold as they might. Germany was, effectively, brandishing a stick. Still recovering from its humiliation in the Japanese War, the Tsarist regime was in no condition to fight. Tsar Nicholas instructed Serbia to back down and avoid further complications. Serbia gained nothing from the crisis. However, two key developments occurred. First, Russia-Serbia relations were strengthened with the appointment of Baron Nicholas Hartwig, a pan-Slavist and admirer of Serbia, as Russian ambassador to Belgrade. Second, the anger and frustration generated by the crisis had a radicalizing effect on nationalist groups. Although disheartened by the government's inability to act, they were not discouraged in their ambitions. The crisis drove a wedge between the Serbian government and the nationalists. In Macedonia, where fighting with Bulgarian bands continued, An activist named Bogdan Radonkovic, along with experienced officers from the Macedonian front, began planning a new secret organization. The result was the founding of Unification or Death, better known as the Black Hand. At its helm was Apis, Dragutin Dmitrievich, the same man who had orchestrated the 1903 coup against King Alexander Obranovich. The organization that would one day ignite powder kegs across Europe had now been born. All that remained was to pull the trigger.